Imagine a forest at night. Not a forest you have walked in, not pine and birch, not the cool, tidy woods of the temperate world. Imagine a rainforest, a true tropical forest, in the lowlands of what is now Guatemala, or Belize, or the Mexican state of Chiapas, on a warm night under a sky so thick with stars that the familiar constellations are almost lost in the swarm of lesser lights behind them. The air is heavy and warm and full of water, the way the air is always full of water in that country, so that even on a clear night there is a softness to the dark, a faint luminous haze rising off the canopy. The forest is not silent. It is never silent. The night is loud with insects, a vast unbroken wall of sound, rising and falling, and through it, from time to time, the deep guttural roar of a howler monkey, a sound so low and so enormous that the first travellers who heard it in the dark were certain it was a jaguar or something worse. Fireflies drift between the trunks. Somewhere water is moving, and everywhere, in every direction, the trees go up and up into the dark. 100 feet and more, their crowns laced together into a roof over the world, so that to stand on the forest floor is to stand at the bottom of a green ocean, in a perpetual dim twilight, even at noon. Now imagine that, as your eyes adjust to the dark, you begin to see that one of the hills in front of you is not a hill. It is too regular, the slope is too even, the summit too flat, and as you look, as the starlight picks out the edges, you see that the green mound rising 200 feet above the forest floor, draped in vines and roots and the accumulated leaf fall of 1,000 years, is a building, a pyramid, a vast stepped pyramid of cut limestone, swallowed by the forest so completely that the trees grow out of its terraces and the monkeys sleep in the temple at its summit, but a building nonetheless, raised by human hands, block by block, a structure as tall as a modern skyscraper of 15 or 20 stories, standing here in the deep forest where there is no city, no road, no living soul for miles in any direction, nothing but the trees and the night and this enormous silent mountain of worked stone that someone long ago decided to build in the middle of the jungle, and then, just as mysteriously, abandoned to the forest and the dark. This is the great puzzle of the Maya, and it is the puzzle we will spend the night exploring, because the Maya built cities, real cities, great cities, some of them among the largest in the world in their day, in one of the most difficult environments on Earth for a civilization to arise, the tropical lowland forest, a place with no great rivers, no rich floodplains, thin soils, no metal, no draft animals, no wheeled vehicles. And in that forest they did not merely survive, they flourished. They built temple pyramids that reached above the canopy. They carved a written language so sophisticated that it could record any sentence in their spoken tongue, the only fully developed writing system ever invented in the entire ancient Americas. They tracked the movements of the planets across centuries with an accuracy that rivaled, and in some respects exceeded anything in the contemporary Old World. They invented, independently, the mathematical concept of zero, centuries before it appeared in Europe. They created a calendar so precise and so vast in its reach that it could name a single day within a cycle of thousands of years. And then, in the space of a century or two, across the heart of their world, they walked away from it, abandoned the great cities to the forest, let the temples fall silent, let the jungle take back the plazas where kings had once danced in jade and quetzal feathers before tens of thousands of their people. Why? That is the question that has drawn travelers and scholars and dreamers into the green dark for 2 centuries, and it is one of the questions we will sit with tonight. But I will tell you now, at the very beginning, so that you can let go of the worry of it. The Maya did not vanish. That is the first and most important thing to understand, and the thing the old romantic story of the lost civilization got most wrong. There are millions of Maya alive today, millions, speaking some 30 different Mayan languages, living in the same lands their ancestors lived in, growing the same maize in the same way, telling some of the same stories. The cities were abandoned, the people were not lost. They are not a vanished race or a mystery of the deep past. They are here, now, our contemporaries, the inheritors of one of the most remarkable civilizations the human species ever produced. We are not going to mourn them tonight. We are going to walk through their world. So let the forest close around you. Let the insects sing. Let the green dark be warm and close and full of the breathing of 1 billion living things. And let the great silent pyramid rise in front of you out of the trees, with the stars swarming overhead. And we will begin as the Maya themselves began every great account, at the very beginning of the world. To understand the Maya, you must first understand the land they made their home, because the Maya world was not one land but several, stitched together into a single cultural sphere, and the differences between its regions shaped everything about how its people lived. The Maya homeland covers what is now southeastern Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and the states of Chiapas and Tabasco, and the modern nations of Guatemala, Belize, and the western edges of Honduras and El Salvador. It is a land of astonishing variety, and the variety is the key to the whole story. Begin in the south, in the highlands of Guatemala, a country of volcanoes, some of them still smoking, of cool mountain valleys and pine forests and rich volcanic soil, of clear lakes lying in the craters of dead volcanoes. The highlands are temperate, fertile, and they hold one resource that the whole Maya world craved: obsidian, the black volcanic glass that, when struck, breaks into blades sharper than any metal the Maya possessed, sharper, in fact, than surgical steel, so sharp that obsidian blades are sometimes still used in delicate eye surgery today. The highlands also held jade, the green stone the Maya prized above all others, above gold, above everything. Jade, the color of new maize and standing water, and the quetzal's feathers, the color of life itself, the most precious substance in their world. To the Maya, jade was not merely valuable, it was sacred, charged with the green power of life and growth and water, the very essence of the precious and the living, and it was placed in the mouths of the dead, and worked into the masks of kings, and buried in the foundations of temples, and cast into the sacred wells, the green stone binding the worlds of the living and the dead, and the gods, worth more than any gold. For gold the Maya valued little, and jade they valued above all things, a difference in the hierarchy of the precious that tells us much about how differently they saw the world from the metal-hungry strangers who would one day come for treasure and be baffled to find these people prizing green stones above the gold. The highlands were the source, and from them the land falls away northward, down through a transitional zone of foothills into the great lowlands. The lowlands are the heartland of the classic Maya, and they are where the puzzle lives. Picture a vast limestone shelf, mostly flat or gently rolling, covered in dense tropical forest, stretching from the highlands of Guatemala north across the base of the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the country of the great classic cities, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, and 100 others, the country of the green pyramids and the swallowed plazas, and it is, by the standards of the great river valley civilizations of the Old World, an almost impossible place to build a civilization. There is no Nile here, no Tigris, no Euphrates, no Yellow River, no great waterway laying down rich silt and offering easy transport. The soils are thin, easily exhausted. The rains come in a season and then stop, and for months the land goes dry, and the limestone shelf is porous, like a sponge, so that the rainwater sinks straight through it and runs away underground, leaving the surface dry even in a land of heavy rain. Water everywhere and nowhere, falling from the sky and vanishing into the rock. How do you build cities in such a place? The Maya answer was ingenuity of a high order, sustained across centuries. They built reservoirs, vast engineered systems of catchment basins and canals and plastered tanks, turning the plazas and the very pyramids of their cities into rain collection surfaces, channeling the water of the wet season into reservoirs that could hold a city through the dry months. At Tikal, the great reservoirs held millions of gallons, and the entire central city was, in effect, a single enormous water management machine. Every paved surface sloped to feed the tanks. They terraced the hillsides and drained the swamps, the bohos, the seasonal wetlands that cover much of the lowlands, turning them into raised fields of astonishing productivity. They managed the forest itself, cultivating useful trees, creating what some scholars now believe was less a wild jungle than a vast, humanized forest garden, shaped over centuries to feed and supply the people who lived within it. The lowland Maya did not conquer their difficult environment so much as they learnt it, intimately, over generations, and worked with it. And that intimate, hard-won, generations-deep knowledge of how to make a great civilization function in a tropical forest is one of the most underappreciated achievements in the human record. And then there is the far north, the northern Yucatan, the flat dry scrubland at the tip of the peninsula, where the forest thins and the rainfall drops and the limestone comes close to the surface. Here, the defining feature of the landscape is the cenote, a natural sinkhole where the limestone roof of an underground cavern has collapsed, opening a window down to the water table, a pool of clear, cool water in the dry land. The cenotes were the wells of the northern Maya, the only reliable source of water in a country with no rivers and few reservoirs, and so they were also sacred, doorways to the underworld, to the realm of the rain god and the dead, places where offerings were made, and, sometimes, where human beings were given to the water. The great city of Chichen Itza grew up beside two of them, and took its name from one, Chichen Itza, the mouth of the well of the Itza. We will come to Chichen Itza and its sacred cenote in the deep of the night. For now, only hold the image, the flat dry scrub, and the sudden round window in the earth, opening down to dark water, where the rain god lived and the offerings sank out of sight. Three lands, then. The volcanic highlands, the forested lowland heartland, the dry northern plain, bound together by trade, by language, by religion, by the constant movement of people and goods and ideas across the whole Maya world. No single empire ever united them. The Maya were never one state, but always a constellation of independent kingdoms, sometimes allied, often at war, sharing a civilization the way the city-states of ancient Greece shared theirs, or the cities of Sumer. To speak of the Maya is to speak of a culture, a family of related peoples and languages, and a shared way of seeing the world. Not a nation, not an empire, but something looser and in some ways more durable, a civilization held together not by a king or an army, but by 1,000 years of shared maize and shared gods and shared time. Long before the Great Pyramids, before the kings and the calendars and the carved stone, there was maize. And to understand the Maya, to understand any of the civilizations of the ancient Americas, you must understand maize, because maize is the foundation on which all of it was built, the single most important plant in the history of the hemisphere, and one of the most remarkable feats of genetic engineering ever accomplished by human beings, though the people who accomplished it had no idea that was what they were doing. Maize does not exist in the wild. This is the astonishing fact at the heart of it. Unlike wheat or rice or barley, which have wild ancestors you can still find growing in their homelands, maize, corn, cannot survive without human beings. Its seeds are locked onto the cob, wrapped in the husk, unable to scatter themselves. A maize plant left to itself simply drops its whole cob on the ground, where the seeds rot or are eaten, and that is the end of it. Maize depends utterly on people to plant it, and it has depended on people for so long that it has lost the ability to live any other way. It is a domesticated species in the most complete sense, a plant that exists only because human beings made it, and that exists only as long as human beings continue to make it. It was made from a wild grass called teosinte, a scrubby Mexican plant whose ears are tiny, a few hard kernels in a single row, encased in stony shells, nothing you would ever look at and think food, let alone the staple that will feed 2 continents. Beginning perhaps 9,000 years ago, in the highlands of southern Mexico, the ancestors of the Maya and their neighbors began the slow, patient, multi-millennial work of transforming this unpromising grass into maize, selecting, season after season, generation after generation, century after century, the plants with the largest kernels, the most kernels, the softest shells, the cobs that held together, until over thousands of years they had bred teosinte into something teosinte's wild ancestors would not recognize. The great heavy ears of maize, hundreds of soft kernels in neat rows, a food so productive and so nourishing that it could support cities, kingdoms, and entire civilization. It is one of the longest and most successful agricultural projects in human history, conducted without writing, without science, without any understanding of genetics, by countless generations of farmers who simply kept the best seed and planted it again, and who, in doing so, slowly built the plant that built the Maya. And the Maya knew it. They knew, in their bones and in their myths, that maize was the foundation of everything, that they were, in the most literal sense, the people of maize. Their great creation story, which we will tell in full when we come to the Popol Vuh, in the deep of the night, records that the gods made the first true human beings out of maize, that after failing to make people out of mud, which dissolved, and out of wood, which had no souls, the gods at last ground white and yellow maize into meal, and from that meal formed human flesh, so that human beings are, in Maya understanding, quite literally made of corn. The maize god was among the most important deities in the Maya pantheon, depicted as a beautiful young man, his head elongated and crowned with the silk and the ripening ear, dying and being reborn with the agricultural year, descending into the underworld and rising again, the eternal cycle of the planted seed that dies in the earth and is reborn as the green shoot. To eat maize was to eat the substance of the god and the substance of yourself. To plant it was to participate in the central drama of the cosmos. The whole of Maya religion, in a sense, grows out of the maize field, out of the miracle, repeated every year, of the dead seed returning as living food. The way they grew it was the milpa, the maize field, but more than a field, a system, a cycle, a way of working the forest that is still practiced by Maya farmers today, and that may be one of the most sustainable forms of agriculture ever devised for the tropical lowlands. In the milpa, maize is not grown alone, but together with beans and squash, the three sisters, as the agricultural traditions of the Americas called them. The beans climbing the maize stalks and fixing nitrogen in the soil to feed the maize, the broad squash leaves shading the ground and holding in moisture and suppressing weeds, the three plants together forming a balanced system that fed the soil even as it fed the people, and that together provided a nearly complete human diet. The maize and beans combining to supply all the essential proteins, the squash adding vitamins and oils. A patch of forest would be cleared and burned, the ash fertilizing the thin soil. The milpa would be planted and cropped for a few years, and then it would be allowed to return to forest, to rest and regenerate, while the farmer moved on to clear a new patch. A long, slow rotation that, properly managed, could sustain a population in the forest indefinitely. The milpa fed the Maya for thousands of years. It feeds their descendants still. There is a deep wisdom in it that the industrial agriculture of the modern world is only now beginning to rediscover. The wisdom of growing many things together, rather than one thing alone. Of feeding the soil, rather than merely stripping it. Of working with the forest's own cycles of growth and rest and renewal, rather than against them. Of taking from the land only what the land, given time, can replace. The milpa is not a primitive technique waiting to be improved by modern methods. It is, in its way, a highly sophisticated system, refined across thousands of years of observation and adjustment, exquisitely adapted to its difficult environment, and capable, as the long survival of the Maya themselves attests, of sustaining human life in the tropical forest across spans of time that make the few centuries of industrial agriculture look very brief indeed. And the question of what happens when the population grows too large for the milpa to sustain, when there are too many people and not enough forest to rest the fields, is one of the threads that runs, dark and uncertain, toward the great collapse we will reach near the end of the night. The story of how the Maya became the Maya is a story of immense depth in time, far deeper than most people imagine when they picture the great classic cities. Human beings had been living in the Maya lands for thousands of years before the first pyramid rose, hunting and gathering, then slowly settling into village life as the mastery of maize made permanent settlement possible. By around 2,000 years before the Common Era, 4,000 years ago, there were settled farming villages across the Maya world, small communities of pole and thatch houses clustered near their milpas, making pottery, burying their dead beneath the floors of their homes, living the quiet agricultural life that is the foundation under every civilization, the broad, slow base of the pyramid of human achievement. We call this long formative age the Preclassic, and for a long time scholars imagined it as exactly that, a slow, simple preamble, a long village prelude before the real action of the classic period began. We now know this was wrong, and the correction is one of the most exciting developments in the recent study of the Maya, because hidden in the Preclassic, deep in the forests of northern Guatemala, were cities, enormous cities, some of the largest the Maya would ever build, raised not in the celebrated classic period but centuries before it, in an age we had dismissed as a mere prologue. The greatest of them was El Mirador. And El Mirador is one of the most astonishing places in the Americas, buried in the dense forest of the Petén, far from any modern road. It was a true metropolis at its height around 2,000 years ago, a city covering many square miles, home to tens of thousands of people, dominated by some of the largest pyramids ever built anywhere in the ancient world. The greatest of them, called La Danta, is a complex of platforms and pyramids rising in stages from the forest floor, and by the measure of total volume, the sheer quantity of stone and fill heaped up by human labor, it is one of the most massive ancient structures on Earth, rivaling the Great Pyramids of Egypt in bulk. Though built of rougher stuff, and now so swallowed by jungle, that you can stand at its base and see only a forested hill, El Mirador was connected to its neighboring cities by causeways, great raised roads of plastered limestone, running dead straight through the forest and swamp for miles, broad enough for crowds, the arteries of a pre-classic civilization far more populous and sophisticated than the old, simple village picture had ever allowed. And then, here is the pattern that will haunt this whole story, appearing now for the first time, long before the famous collapse, El Mirador fell. Around 1700 to 2000 years ago, this great pre-classic metropolis and many of its neighbors were abandoned, their pyramids left to the forest, their causeways grown over, their populations dispersed or moved away. The reasons are debated, as the reasons for the later collapse are debated. Environmental degradation, the silting and ruining of the swamps the city depended on, drought, warfare, some combination. But the fact is clear, and it is sobering. The Maya had already built and lost a great civilization once, in the deep pre-classic, centuries before the classic cities we know best even rose. The collapse at the end of the classic period, which we tend to treat as the single great mystery of the Maya, was not the first time the forest had taken back a metropolis. It was the second. The pattern of brilliant rise and enigmatic fall was older than Tikal, older than Palenque, woven into the long relationship between the Maya and their difficult, beautiful, demanding land from the very beginning. But the people did not vanish when El Mirador fell, any more than they would vanish at the end of the classic period. They moved, they regrouped, they rebuilt elsewhere, and out of the dispersal of the pre-classic world rose the cities of the classic Maya. Tikal, which had been a modest center in El Mirador's shadow, and now grew into a great power in its own right, and 100 others, across the lowlands, each one a kingdom, each one ruled by a king who claimed descent from the gods and the founding ancestors, each one carving its history into stone in the elaborate written language that is one of the supreme achievements of the Maya and one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern world to recover. To that writing, to the glyphs, and the long struggle to read them, and the voices of the Maya kings speaking again across 12 centuries of silence, we turn now. For most of the time that the modern world has known about the Maya, their writing was silent. The great stone monuments were covered in elaborate carved symbols, blocks of intricate glyphs, beautiful and dense and utterly impenetrable, arranged in neat double columns down the faces of the stelae and across the lintels and stairways of the ruined cities. Everyone could see that it was writing. No one could read it. For over a century after the ruins were first brought to the world's attention, the glyphs kept their secrets, and the Maya remained, in the most literal sense, a civilization that could not speak for itself, known only through its silent stones and through the hostile or uncomprehending accounts of the Spanish who had conquered its descendants. The recovery of the ability to read Maya writing, accomplished mostly in the second half of the 20th century, is one of the great intellectual achievements of our age, comparable to the cracking of Egyptian hieroglyphs from the Rosetta Stone, and it transformed the Maya from a mysterious, faceless, lost civilization into a world of named kings and dated events and recorded history, a people who could, at last, tell us in their own words who they had been. Maya writing is the only fully developed writing system known to have been independently invented in the ancient Americas, the only one capable of recording the complete spoken language, any sentence a person could say, rather than merely a limited set of signs or symbols. It is a thing of great beauty and great sophistication. The glyphs are not, as early scholars wrongly assumed, simple pictures, one symbol, one idea. They are a mixed system, like Egyptian or like Japanese, combining two kinds of signs, logograms, which stand for whole words, and syllabic signs, which stand for sounds, for syllables, so that a Maya scribe could spell out any word phonetically, syllable by syllable, or write it with a word sign, or, and this is part of what made the script so hard to crack, combine the two, mixing word signs and sound signs in the same word, even spelling the same word different ways on different monuments, for the sheer artistic pleasure of variation. The script could be written in many ways, the individual glyph blocks elaborated and merged and decorated almost without limit, so that Maya writing is as much an art form as a recording system. Each inscription a unique composition. The scribes, who were among the most honored members of Maya society, often royal themselves, displaying their virtuosity in the endless inventive recombination of the signs. What did they write? Everything, we now believe, though most of it is lost. On the stone monuments that survive, they wrote history, the accessions of kings, the dates of their births and deaths, their conquests and their captives, their marriages and alliances, the dedications of their temples, the great rituals of bloodletting and ceremony, all of it precisely dated in the elaborate Maya calendar, anchored in time with a precision unmatched anywhere in the ancient Americas. The stelae of the classic cities are, in effect, public monuments of dynastic propaganda, the kings recording their glory and their legitimacy for their people and for posterity, carving their names into stone so that they would not be forgotten. And they were not forgotten, in the end, though it took the modern world more than 1,000 years to learn to read them again. When the decipherment finally came, and we will tell that story, the story of the long struggle and the breakthrough near the end of the night, the silent stones began to speak, and the names came out of them one by one. The kings of Tikal and Calakmul and Palenque and Copan, their reigns and their wars and their deaths, a whole lost political history of the classic Maya world, rising up out of the carved stone after 12 centuries of silence, in the king's own words. But the stone monuments were only a fraction of Maya writing. The Maya also wrote books, thousands of them we must assume, though almost none survive. They made paper from the inner bark of the fig tree, beaten and smoothed and coated with fine white lime plaster, and folded it into screenfold books called codices that opened out like an accordion into long painted strips. In these books, written and painted by the scribe priests, the Maya recorded their astronomical knowledge, their calendars, their rituals, their divination, their histories, the accumulated learning of their civilization. There were libraries of them, and they are almost all gone, not lost to time and the rotting damp of the tropical climate, though that destroyed many, but deliberately burned, in the 16th century by Spanish priests who regarded them as the work of the devil. We will come to that act of destruction, and to the 4 lonely codices that survived it, in the deep of the night, because it is one of the great tragedies in the history of human knowledge. For now, hold this, that the Maya were a people of books, a literate civilization with libraries and scribes and a written literature, and that the overwhelming majority of everything they ever wrote was destroyed, so that what we can read today, the stone monuments, the painted pottery, the 4 surviving books, is the barest fragment of a vast lost literature, a few pages torn from a library that was burned. The wonder is not how little we can read, the wonder is that we can read anything at all. If there is one thing for which the Maya are most famous, one achievement that has captured the imagination of the modern world more than any other, it is their obsession with time. The Maya were, above all, keepers of time, timekeepers of extraordinary sophistication, who built a system of interlocking calendars so precise, so vast in its reach, and so deeply woven into their understanding of the cosmos, that time itself became, for them, almost a kind of god, a living thing, a burden carried by the deities through the cycles of the ages, a sacred order that the priests had to track and understand in order to know the will of the gods and the proper conduct of human life. The Maya did not have one calendar. They had several, running simultaneously, interlocking like the gears of an impossibly complex machine, each one measuring time in a different way, the whole system together producing a picture of time of remarkable richness and depth. The first was the sacred calendar, the Tzolk'in, a cycle of 260 days, formed by the interlocking of 20 named days with the numbers 1 through 13, so that each day had both a number and a name, and the same combination would not recur for 260 days. Why 260? No one is entirely certain, and the question has fascinated scholars for generations. It is close to the length of human pregnancy, from a missed period to birth. It matches the interval between zenith passages of the sun at certain Maya latitudes. It corresponds to cycles of the planet Venus and to agricultural rhythms. Most likely it grew from several of these at once, the way the deepest cultural patterns usually do. Whatever its origin, the Tzolk'in was the sacred heartbeat of Maya life, the calendar of divination and ritual and naming, the cycle by which a person's day of birth determined their character and their fate. The calendar the priests consulted to know which days were auspicious and which were dangerous, which were proper for planting or for war or for the accession of a king. Running alongside the sacred calendar was the solar calendar, the Harb, a cycle of 365 days, close to the true solar year, made up of 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short, ominous period of 5 extra days at the end, the Weeb, regarded as deeply unlucky, a dangerous gap in the year when the boundaries between the human world and the world of the spirits grew thin, and people stayed close to home and made offerings to ward off the bad luck of those 5 nameless days. And the 2 calendars, the sacred 260-day cycle and the solar 365-day cycle, turned together, gear within gear, so that any given combination of a Tzolk'in day and a Harb day would not recur for 52 years, a period the peoples of ancient Mexico called the calendar round, the great cycle of the human life, the span after which the 2 calendars returned to their starting alignment and time, in a sense, began again. The completion of a 52-year calendar round was one of the most charged moments in the Mesoamerican world. A turning of the age, a moment of danger and renewal when the cycle closed and a new one opened. But the Maya wanted more than the 52-year cycle. They wanted to fix events in absolute time, to name a single day uniquely across not decades but millennia. And for this they invented the most remarkable of all their calendars, the long count, a linear count of days from a fixed starting point deep in the mythological past, a date that corresponds, in our calendar, to a day in August of the year 3114 before the Common Era, the date, in Maya cosmology, of the creation of the present world. From that 0 point, the long count simply counts the days forward, in a place-value system of nested cycles. The kin, 1 day, the winal, 20 days, the ton, 360 days, the katun, 20 tons, about 20 years, the baktun, 20 katuns, about 394 years, and on up into vast cycles encompassing millions of years. With the long count, a Maya scribe could fix any event on a single, unique, never-repeating day, counted precisely from the creation of the world, and the classic Maya did exactly that, carving long count dates onto their monuments with obsessive precision, dating the deeds of their kings to the exact day across the centuries, so that we can say, today, with complete confidence, that a particular king of Tikal acceded to the throne on a specific day in what we would call the year 682, or that a particular monument at Quirigua records an event on a day in 738. No other civilization of the ancient Americas tracked time with anything approaching this precision. Few civilizations anywhere ever have. And here we must gently address the thing that, for many people, is the only thing they have ever heard about the Maya calendar. The supposed prophecy that the world would end in December of the year 2012. This was, to put it plainly, a modern misunderstanding, and a rather sad one, because it obscured the real achievement behind a manufactured panic. What actually happened in December 2012 was that the long count completed 13 baktons, a large, round, significant cycle in the Maya count, a kind of cosmic odometer rolling over, the end of a great age and the beginning of the next. The Maya themselves did not, as far as we know from anything they actually wrote, predict the end of the world at this point. They predicted the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new one, exactly as the completion of a calendar round or a katun was the end of one cycle and the start of another. Time, for the Maya, was cyclical as well as linear. Ages ended and new ages began. The world had been created and destroyed several times before the present creation, and would be again. The completion of the 13th baktun was a moment of renewal, not annihilation, a turning of the great wheel, which the Maya, the people who built their entire civilization around the patient tracking of such turnings, would have understood not with terror, but with the deep, calm recognition of people who knew that all cycles end, and all cycles begin again, and that the proper response to the turning of an age is not panic but ceremony. Underneath the calendars, making them possible, was mathematics, and the mathematics of the Maya was one of their most remarkable intellectual achievements, containing within it a concept so profound that its independent invention ranks among the great moments in the history of human thought, the concept of zero. The Maya counted in 20s, not 10s, a vigesimal system, almost certainly rooted in the ancient human habit of counting on both fingers and toes, 20 digits, 20 units before the count rolls over. And like the Babylonians before them, and like the system we use today, the Maya developed a true place value notation, a way of writing numbers in which the position of a symbol determines its value, so that the same symbol means one thing in one place and 20 times as much in the next place up. This is a profound and powerful idea, and it has been independently invented only a very few times in the whole history of the human species. Most counting systems, Roman numerals for instance, are additive, piling up symbols, and they become hopelessly clumsy for large numbers and nearly impossible to calculate with. Place value notation, by contrast, allows the representation of any number, however large, with a small set of symbols, and makes calculation tractable. The Maya had it. They wrote their numbers vertically, in stacked positions, each position 20 times the value of the one below it, using just 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and, crucially, a special sign, often a stylized shell, for 0, 0. It is easy, from inside a civilization that takes it for granted, to underestimate what an achievement the concept of zero is. For most of human history, most civilizations did not have it, did not have a symbol, a number, for nothing, for the empty place, for the absence of quantity. The Greeks, for all their mathematical genius, never developed a true zero. The Romans had nothing like it. The concept arose independently only a handful of times. In Mesopotamia, in a limited form. In India, from where it eventually reached Europe via the Arab world, in the form we use today, and, entirely separately, on the other side of the world, with no possible contact or influence, among the Maya and their Mesoamerican neighbors. The Maya needed zero because their place value system required it. Because to write a number with an empty position, you need a symbol to hold that position, to say, nothing here, but keep counting. And so they invented it, this profound abstraction, the number that is not a quantity, the something that represents nothing. Invented it centuries before it reached Europe, in the forests of Central America, to serve the needs of their calendars and their astronomy. It is one of the clearest proofs we have, if any were needed, that the human mind, working independently in utterly different circumstances on opposite sides of the planet, arrives again and again at the same deep truths, that mathematics is discovered, not merely invented, and that the Maya, gazing at the heavens from their forest cities, found the same foundations of number that the sages of India and Mesopotamia found, and built upon them a science of time and the stars that was, in its way, the equal of anything in the ancient world. With this mathematics, the Maya calculated. They calculated the calendars, the interlocking cycles, the long count reaching back to creation and forward into the deep future, and they calculated the movements of the heavens, for the mathematics and the calendar and the astronomy were, in Maya understanding, all one thing, a single great science of cosmic order, the tracking of the sacred rhythms by which the gods governed the world. To the astronomy, to the Maya watching the planets from their rooftop observatories, and above all to their extraordinary obsession with the planet Venus, we turn now. The Maya watched the sky with the patience of people for whom the sky was the face of the gods, and the most careful watching of all they reserved for a single brilliant point of light, the planet Venus, the morning and evening star, the most beautiful and, to the Maya, the most dangerous object in the heavens. Their tracking of Venus is one of the most precise astronomical achievements of the ancient world, and the reverence and dread with which they regarded it tells us something deep about how they understood the cosmos and their place in it. Venus, to the Maya, was not a thing of beauty and love as it was to the Romans who named it for their goddess. It was a thing of war and danger. The Maya watched it move through its cycle, appearing as the morning star, rising before the sun, vanishing into the glare of the sun for a period, reappearing as the evening star, setting after the sun, vanishing again as it passed between the earth and the sun. And they tracked this whole cycle with extraordinary accuracy. The true average length of the Venus cycle is about 584 days. The Maya calculated it, in the surviving astronomical tables, to within a fraction of a day, and they understood that 5 Venus cycles correspond almost exactly to 8 solar years, and wove these relationships into their calendars with a precision that modern astronomers have confirmed and admired. The Dresden Codex, one of the 4 surviving Maya books, which we will come to, contains elaborate Venus tables tracking the planet's movements across centuries, correcting for the small discrepancies that accumulate over time, a sustained work of mathematical astronomy that any ancient civilization would have been proud to produce. And the reason they watched Venus so closely was that they feared it. The reappearance of Venus as the morning star, after its period of invisibility, its heliacal rising, in astronomical terms, was regarded as a moment of acute danger, when the war star's first rays could strike down the vulnerable, kings, children, the crops. The astronomical tables were, in part, a way of predicting these dangerous moments, so that they could be guarded against with the proper rituals. And warfare itself was timed to the movements of Venus, the so-called Star Wars of the classic Maya, attacks and raids timed to coincide with significant stations of the planet, the brilliant war star in the sky sanctifying and empowering the violence below. To make war under Venus was to make war with the blessing of the heavens. The planet that the Old World named for the goddess of love was, in the forests of the Maya, the patron of battle and the harbinger of death, a difference that reminds us how completely a civilization constructs its own sky, reading its own meanings into the same lights that every human being who ever lived has looked up and seen. Beyond Venus, the Maya tracked the moon, predicting eclipses with real accuracy through the patient accumulation of observation across generations. The Dresden Codex contains eclipse tables as well as Venus tables, warning of the dangerous days when the sun or moon might be devoured. They tracked the sun itself, building their cities and their temples in alignment with its movements, so that on the equinoxes or the solstices the light would strike a particular doorway, illuminate a particular carving, or, most famously, at Chichen Itza, in the deep of the night ahead, cast a shadow in the shape of a descending serpent down the staircase of a pyramid. They knew the Pleiades, the Milky Way, which they saw as a great cosmic road, or a world tree, or a celestial river, depending on the season and the myth, and the constellations of their own zodiac, figured as creatures of the forest, a scorpion, a turtle, a peccary, a jaguar. The whole sky was a text to them, as it had been to the Babylonians, a sacred book written in light, recording the will and the movements of the gods, and the priest astronomers who could read it, who could predict the eclipse, the rising of Venus, the turning of the seasons, held immense power, for they alone could tell the king and the people what the gods intended and when the sacred moments would come. We come now to the height of Maya civilization, the period we call the Classic, running roughly from the 3rd to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, the 600 years when the great lowland cities flourished, when the kings raised their carved monuments and their towering temples, when the population of the Maya world reached its peak, and its art and writing reached their fullest development. This is the world of Tikal and Calakmul, of Palenque and Copan and Yaxchilan and 100 other kingdoms, the world that the green pyramids and the silent stelae come down to us from, the classic Maya world of the imagination. And at the center of each of its many kingdoms stood a single figure, the linchpin of the whole society, the Holy Lord, the Divine King. The Maya word was Kualajar, Holy Lord, Divine King. Each Maya city was a kingdom, and each kingdom was ruled by a king who was far more than a political leader. He was a sacred being, a living link between the human world and the world of the gods and ancestors, the indispensable intermediary on whom the prosperity of the whole kingdom depended. It was the king who performed the great rituals that kept the cosmos in order, the king who let his own blood to feed the gods and open the channel to the other world, the king who danced in the regalia of the gods at the great ceremonies, becoming, for the duration of the rite, the god himself, the king whose accession, whose victories, whose very bodily existence were the guarantee of the kingdom's connection to the sacred order. The king embodied the kingdom. His monuments proclaimed his descent from the founding ancestors and the gods. His portraits showed him in the guise of the maize god, the sun god, the gods of the sky and the underworld. His life was a sacred performance, conducted before his people, on which their collective well-being was understood to depend. This is why the carved monuments are so obsessed with the persons of the kings, their births, their accessions, their rituals, their wars, their deaths. The stelae are not history in our sense, the impartial record of events. They are sacred dynastic propaganda, the king proclaiming his legitimacy and his divine connection, his unbroken descent from the founders, his triumphs in war and ritual, all of it precisely dated in the long count, anchored in sacred time. To us, reading them now, they are the most precious of historical documents, the only contemporary written record of classic Maya political history. To the Maya who carved and viewed them, they were something more like icons, sacred images of the Holy Lord, charged with the power of his name and his deeds, raised in the great plazas where the people gathered for the ceremonies, a permanent assertion in stone that this king, this dynasty, this kingdom, stood in its proper place in the order of the cosmos. And the kingdoms were many, and they were rivals. This is the crucial thing to understand about the political world of the classic Maya. There was never a single Maya empire, never one ruler over the whole Maya world, but always a shifting constellation of independent kingdoms, dozens of them, large and small, allying and warring and trading and intermarrying in an endlessly complex political dance. Some kingdoms were great powers, dominating their neighbors and exacting tribute. Others were minor centers, clients of the greater powers, drawn into their orbits and their wars. The political landscape resembled, more than anything, the world of the ancient Greek city-states, or the city-states of Sumer or of Renaissance Italy, a system of competing sovereignties, sharing a single civilization, bound by common culture and divided by common ambition. And at the center of that system, for much of the classic period, stood two great rival powers, two superpowers whose long struggle for dominance shaped the history of the entire Maya lowlands, Tikal and Calakmul. To their rivalry, one of the great power struggles of the ancient Americas, recovered in our own time from the decipherment of the glyphs, we turn now. Tikal is, for many people, the image of the Maya itself, the great city in the Guatemalan forest, its towering temple pyramids rising sheer above the canopy, the most famous and one of the most magnificent of all the Maya cities, and one of the most thoroughly explored. To stand in the great plaza of Tikal at dawn, with the mist rising off the forest and the howler monkeys roaring in the trees and the steep temples climbing into the brightening sky on either hand, is to stand in one of the most extraordinary places human beings have ever made, and to feel, with a force that no description can convey, the sheer ambition of the civilization that raised it in the depths of the forest. Tikal had been a settlement since the Preclassic, growing in the shadow of mighty El Mirador to the north. When El Mirador fell, Tikal endured and rose, and by the Classic period it had become one of the two greatest powers in the Maya world, a city of perhaps 60,000 people or more at its height, with a vast hinterland of dependent towns and villages, ruled by a long dynasty of holy lords who traced their line back to a founder named Yax'ibishuk, the dynasty stretching across more than 30 kings and the better part of 1,000 years. Its temples are the tallest the classic Maya built. Temple 4, the Great Pyramid on the western edge of the city, rises some 70 meters, 230 feet, from the forest floor to the roof comb of the temple at its summit, taller than any other Maya structure, one of the tallest pre-modern buildings in all of the Americas, and to climb it and emerge above the forest canopy, with the green stretching unbroken to every horizon and the roof combs of the other great temples breaking through the canopy like islands in a green sea, is one of the unforgettable experiences the ancient world has left for us. The name Tikal is a modern one, given by the people who rediscovered it. The Maya themselves seem to have called it Mutal or Yaxmutal, and its emblem glyph, the symbol that stood for the kingdom and its ruling dynasty, appears on monuments across the Maya world, a mark of how far Tikal's power and prestige reached. For Tikal was not merely a great city, it was an imperial power, in the loose Maya sense, dominating its neighbors, planting its allies and clients on the thrones of other kingdoms, projecting its influence across hundreds of miles of forest. And in the 4th century, Tikal's history took a dramatic turn that the decipherment of the glyphs has only recently allowed us to read, a turn that connects this forest kingdom, astonishingly, to the greatest power of the ancient Americas, far to the west. In the year we would call 317, the monuments record the arrival at Tikal of a figure named Siaj Kark, Fire is Born, and on the very same day, the reigning king of Tikal died. The coincidence is not a coincidence. What seems to have happened, and the glyphs, read against the archaeology, tell a startling story, is that Tikal was, in effect, conquered or taken over by an outside power, and that outside power came from Teotihuacan, the vast metropolis in the highlands of central Mexico, hundreds of miles to the west, the greatest city in all of the ancient Americas, a planned metropolis of well over 100,000 people, dominated by its own colossal pyramids of the sun and the moon, a civilization not Maya at all but exerting, at its height, an influence across the whole of Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan reached into the Maya world, through trade, through diplomacy, and, it now appears, at Tikal in 378, through something very like conquest, installing a new dynasty with Teotihuacan connections, remaking the kingdom in its image, binding the forest city to the distant highland superpower. The Maya world was never isolated. It was part of a vast Mesoamerican web of trade and influence and power, and the greatest of the classic Maya cities bore, in its art and its dynasty and its history, the mark of the great metropolis to the west, a reminder that no civilization, however distinctive, ever truly stands alone. For much of the classic period, the political history of the Maya lowlands was shaped by a single overarching rivalry, a long, bitter, century-spanning struggle between two superpowers for dominance over the whole forest world. On one side stood Tikal, in the central Petén, on the other stood its great rival to the north, Calakmul, the kingdom whose emblem glyph was the snakehead, the kingdom the Maya called Khan, the Snake Kingdom, a power as great as Tikal, perhaps for a time greater, whose long contest with Tikal for supremacy is one of the great recovered narratives of Maya history, pieced together over the last few decades from the patient reading of the glyphs across dozens of sites. The Snake Kingdom played a long game, and for a long time it played it better than Tikal. Rather than confronting Tikal directly, Calakmul worked through alliances and clients, encircling Tikal with a ring of allied kingdoms, turning Tikal's neighbors against it, building a vast network of vassal states and marriage alliances that gradually isolated the great central power. The strategy worked. In the 6th century, this encirclement culminated in catastrophe for Tikal. a great defeat, recorded in the glyphs, that inaugurated what scholars call Tikal's hiatus, a period of more than a century, during which Tikal raised almost no monuments, a long dark age of defeat and diminishment, while Calakmul and its allies flourished. The Snake Kingdom had, for a time, won. Its web of alliances spanned the lowlands, its kings were the most powerful in the Maya world. The great central rival lay humbled and silent, but Tikal endured, as it had endured the fall of El Mirador, and in the late 7th century it rose again, under a king whose name has come down to us, and who became one of the heroes of the recovered Maya history, Chichén Itzá. In the year we would call 695, Chichén Itzá of Tikal confronted the army of Calakmul and its king, and defeated them. A great victory, reversing generations of Calakmul dominance, recorded in triumph on Tikal's monuments, breaking the power of the Snake Kingdom and restoring Tikal to greatness. The long war turned. Tikal rebuilt, raising the great temples that still stand, including the towering pyramid beneath which Chichén Itzá himself was eventually buried, in a tomb rich with jade and pearl and carved bone, one of the great royal burials of the Maya world. Calakmul declined, and Tikal entered a final age of glory, the age of its tallest temples and its greatest monuments, before the shadow that was already gathering over the whole Maya world fell on it too. The rivalry of Tikal and Calakmul is worth dwelling on, in the quiet of the forest night, because of what it reveals about the classic Maya world, and about a misconception that long distorted our view of it. For a great part of the 20th century, scholars imagined the classic Maya as a uniquely peaceful civilization, a gentle people of stargazing priests and patient farmers, ruled not by warlike kings, but by serene astronomer-philosophers, contemplating the heavens in their forest temples, untroubled by the warfare and politics that consumed the other civilizations of the ancient world. It was a beautiful picture. It was almost entirely wrong. The decipherment of the glyphs revealed a Maya world as political, as ambitious, as warlike, and as bloody as any other. A world of rival kings and shifting alliances, of conquest and tribute and the ritual sacrifice of captured enemies, of superpowers contending for dominance across the forest exactly as superpowers have contended everywhere, in every age. The serene philosopher kings were a modern fantasy, projected onto the silent stones in the long centuries before anyone could read what the stones actually said. When the glyphs spoke at last, they spoke of war, and yet, this is the thing to hold, the thing that keeps the Maya from being merely one more chronicle of ancient violence. The same kings who made war also tracked Venus across the centuries, also calculated the cycles of the moon, also raised the most beautiful art and the most sophisticated writing of the ancient Americas, also pondered the deep structure of time and built their cities in alignment with the movements of the heavens. They were not philosophers instead of warriors, and they were not warriors instead of philosophers. They were both, at once, as human beings so often are capable of the calculation of the Venus cycle and the sacrifice of the captured king on the same afternoon, in the same plaza, under the same indifferent stars. The Maya were not gentler than the rest of humanity, and they were not crueler. They were, in the end, recognizably, fully human, which is the most interesting thing any civilization can be. If Tikal is the image of Maya grandeur, Palenque is the image of Maya beauty, a smaller city, set against the forested foothills where the highlands of Chiapas meet the lowland plain, a place of exquisite architecture and the most refined art in the Maya world, and the setting for one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made in the Americas, the tomb of the great king Pakal, sealed for 13 centuries in the heart of a pyramid, found intact in the 1950s, the Maya equivalent of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Palenque sits where the land rises, the last of the lowland plain before the hills, watered by clear streams that the Maya channeled through the city in stone aqueducts, surrounded by forest that presses close. Its buildings are not the massive, steep, sky-reaching pyramids of Tikal. They are lighter, more graceful, more delicate. Palaces with airy galleries and a unique square tower, temples with elegant roof combs, and walls once covered in the finest stucco sculpture the Maya ever made, modelled portraits and scenes of such naturalism and grace that they stand among the masterpieces of ancient American art. And Palenque is, above all, the city of one king, the king who made it great and whose monuments fill it. Kinich Janab Pakal, Pakal the Great, who came to the throne as a boy in the year 615 and ruled for the better part of 70 years, one of the longest reigns in all of Maya history, dying at last an old man in 683, having transformed his kingdom from a battered minor power into one of the jewels of the classic Maya world. Pakal's monuments tell his story, and they tell it, in part, to solve a problem. For Pakal had come to the throne through his mother, a queen named Sak-Kuk, in a line of succession that was irregular by the usual rules, and much of his great building program seems designed to assert and justify his legitimacy, to weave his somewhat awkward claim into the sacred order of descent from gods and ancestors. The most beautiful of his monuments is the Temple of the Inscriptions, the great pyramid that dominates the center of Palenque, and it was here, in 1952, that the archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luyille made the discovery that astonished the world. Noticing that one of the great flagstones in the floor of the temple at the pyramid's summit had a double row of holes, as if it had once been meant to be lifted, Ruiz had it raised, and found beneath it a rubble-filled passage, a hidden staircase descending into the heart of the pyramid. It took his team 4 seasons to clear it, season after season of hauling out the rubble that the Maya had packed into the stairway to seal it, and at the bottom, deep beneath the base of the pyramid, below the level of the plaza outside, they found a sealed chamber, and within it, a single colossal sarcophagus, its lid a vast carved slab of limestone, and inside, the skeleton of a tall man, his face covered by a mask of jade mosaic, his body laden with jade rings on every finger, jade bracelets, a jade bead in each hand and one in his mouth, the green stone of life surrounding the dead king in the dark heart of the mountain he had built to hold him. It was Pakal, and the great carved lid of his sarcophagus is one of the most famous and most beautiful objects in all of Maya art. A complex, exquisite composition showing the dead king at the moment of his death, falling backward down the great world tree into the open jaws of the underworld, the tree rising above him toward the heavens with the celestial bird perched in its branches, the whole cosmos rendered in a single image of death and the promise of rebirth. The king poised forever between the underworld below and the sky above, at the center of the tree that joins the 3 worlds. It is a meditation on death and resurrection of extraordinary depth and beauty, and it is, incidentally, the image that a certain strain of fantasy has tried to reinterpret as an ancient astronaut piloting a rocket ship, a misreading so determined to find aliens that it cannot see the actual, documented, far more interesting meaning carved in the stone. A Maya king, falling into the underworld at the moment of death, down the great tree at the center of the world, toward the rebirth that Maya religion promised, exactly as the accompanying inscriptions, which can now be read, describe. The truth of the stone is more beautiful than the fantasy. It usually is, far to the southeast of the great Petén cities, near the modern border between Honduras and Guatemala, in a beautiful river valley among the foothills, lies Copan, the southeastern jewel of the Maya world, a kingdom renowned above all others for the magnificence of its sculpture, and for the longest written text the ancient Maya ever produced. A stairway of carved stone steps that is, quite literally, a history book made of architecture. Copan was a city of artists. Its sculptors worked the local volcanic stone, softer and more workable than the limestone of the lowlands, into carvings of a depth and richness and 3-dimensionality unmatched elsewhere in the Maya world. Its great stelae are not the flat relief portraits of other cities, but nearly freestanding statues, the kings emerging almost fully from the stone, wrapped in an incredible density of detail, every inch of the surface alive with gods and symbols and glyphs. Copan's dynasty was founded in the year 426 by a king named Kinich Yax Kukmor, radiant first Quetzal Makor, who, the archaeology suggests, came from outside the valley, perhaps with connections to Tikal or even distant Teotihuacan, and established a line of kings that would rule Copan for 4 centuries. His successors made the city great, raising its temples and plazas and its famous ball court, filling it with the carved monuments that make it the open-air museum of Maya art. And the greatest of its monuments is the hieroglyphic stairway, a single staircase of more than 60 steps, climbing the face of a temple pyramid, every step carved with glyphs, more than 2,000 of them in all, the longest single Maya inscription known to exist, recording the dynastic history of Copan, the deeds of its kings, the sacred narrative of the kingdom, climbing step by carved step toward the temple at the summit. It is a history book you walk up, the past of the kingdom literally built into the path to the holy place, so that to ascend to the temple was to ascend through the recorded deeds of the ancestors, climbing the dynasty itself. But Copan's history holds a darker lesson too, and it is one that points toward the great collapse ahead. Late in the city's history, around the year 738, Copan's king, a ruler named Waxaclajun Ubar Kawil, 18 are the images of Kawil, sometimes called 18 Rabbit in the older literature, was captured and beheaded by the king of a smaller neighboring kingdom, Quirigua, which had been a client of Copan and now violently broke free. It was a catastrophe and a humiliation, the great king taken and sacrificed by a former vassal. And though Copan recovered and continued for another century, raising still more monuments, the shock seems to mark a turning point, and the later history of Copan, studied intensively by archaeologists, reveals the slow gathering of the forces that would bring the classic Maya world down, a population that grew and grew, filling the valley, pushing cultivation up onto the steep hillsides, stripping the forest from the slopes, erosion and soil exhaustion following the deforestation, the skeletons of the later population showing the marks of malnutrition and disease, growing worse over the generations, the valley filling beyond what its land could sustainably feed, even as the kings raised ever more monuments proclaiming their glory and their connection to the gods. Copan is one of the places where we can watch, in the archaeology, the slow-motion approach of the catastrophe, the population overshoot, the environmental degradation, the strain building beneath the magnificent surface of the late classic city, the gathering of the storm that would, within a century or two, empty Copan and Tikal and Palenque and the whole great heartland of the classic Maya world, and leave the temples to the forest. Throughout the Maya world, in nearly every city of any size, there is a structure of a particular and unmistakable shape. Two long parallel platforms or walls facing each other across a narrow paved court, often with sloping sides, sometimes with stone rings set high in the walls. This is the ball court, and the game played within it. A game played across all of Mesoamerica for thousands of years, by the Maya and the Aztecs and a dozen other peoples. A game older than any of the great civilizations that played it, was far more than a sport. It was a ritual, a reenactment of cosmic myth, a contest charged with the deepest religious meaning, and sometimes, at its most solemn, a matter of life and death. The game was played with a ball of solid rubber, and rubber itself was a Mesoamerican invention, the peoples of the region having learnt to process the latex of the rubber tree, mixing it with the juice of morning glory vines to make it bounce and last, thousands of years before the modern world learnt the secret of rubber. The ball was heavy, solid, dangerous. It could weigh several kilograms, and a blow from it could break bones or kill. And the players struck it not with hands or feet, but with their hips, their thighs, their upper arms, wearing heavy padding, yokes of leather or wood around the waist, to strike the ball and to protect the body, driving the heavy ball back and forth across the court, keeping it in play, scoring by getting it past the opponents, or, in some versions, through the stone rings high in the walls, a feat so difficult that it could end a game on the instant. It was fast, brutal, athletic and skilled. A real sport, played for the love of it in courts across the Maya world, as well as a sacred rite, for the ball game was, at its deepest level, a reenactment of the central myth of Maya religion, the story of the hero twins who play the ball game against the lords of death in the underworld, and who, through cunning and sacrifice and resurrection, defeat death itself. We will tell that story, the great myth of the Popol Vuh, in full, in the deep of the night, but hold, for now, the meaning it gave the game. That to play the ball game was to reenact the cosmic contest between life and death, between the forces of the sky and the forces of the underworld, between the hero twins and the lords of Xibalba. The court itself was understood as a portal to the underworld, a liminal space between worlds. The movement of the ball was the movement of the sun, or of Venus, or of the heavenly bodies through the sky and the underworld. The game was a sacred drama with the order of the cosmos at stake, and at its most solemn, in certain ritual contexts, particularly involving captured enemies, defeated kings, prisoners of war. The ball game could end in human sacrifice, the losers, or perhaps in some cases the winners, given to the gods, their blood feeding the cosmic order, their deaths reenacting the deaths and resurrections of the hero twins in the underworld. The carved ball court panels of some cities show exactly this. A player, kneeling, decapitated, his blood transforming into serpents or vegetation, the sacrifice that feeds the world. How often the game actually ended in death, and in what circumstances, we do not fully know. It was surely not the usual outcome of an ordinary match, but reserved for the most charged ritual occasions, that the possibility was always there, woven into the meaning of the game, that this contest, this beautiful, brutal athletic contest played in the stone court between the sloping walls, was a matter of life and death, not only in metaphor but, sometimes, in blood. To understand how the Maya saw their world, and they saw it whole, a single integrated cosmos in which the king's bloodletting and the movement of Venus and the planting of the maize and the playing of the ballgame were all part of one sacred order. We must spend an hour with their picture of the universe, because it is one of the richest and most beautiful cosmologies any human culture has ever constructed, and it underlies everything else: the calendars, the kingship, the sacrifice, the art, the very shape of the cities. The Maya cosmos had 3 levels, joined at the center by a great tree. There was the sky above, the 13 layers of the heavens, through which the sun and moon and planets moved, the realm of the celestial gods and the deified ancestors, arched over the world like the back of a great cosmic crocodile or serpent. There was the earth, the middle world, the flat surface on which human beings lived, often imagined as the back of a vast turtle or crocodile floating on the primordial sea, oriented to the 4 directions, and the 4 directions were central to Maya thought, each with its own color and its own god and its own associations. East, the red direction, where the sun rose, the direction of beginnings. West, black, where the sun died into the underworld. North, white, associated with the ancestors and the heavens. South, yellow, and the center, the 5th direction, the most important, was blue-green, the color of jade and water and the precious center of all things. And below the earth was the underworld, Sibalba, the place of fright, the realm of the lords of death, a watery, rotting, terrifying region of disease and decay and darkness, into which the sun descended each night, into which the dead passed, into which the hero twins journeyed in the great myth, the place of death through which one had to pass, and which one might, like the sun each dawn, like the maize each spring, like the hero twins in the story, hope to survive and rise from again. And joining the 3 worlds, growing up through the center of the cosmos, from the underworld, through the earth into the sky, was the great world tree, the ceiba tree, the giant of the tropical forest, sacred above all trees to the Maya, its roots in the underworld, its trunk in the world of human beings, its branches in the heavens, the axis on which the whole cosmos turned, the road by which gods and souls and the dead traveled between the worlds. The world tree is everywhere in Maya art and thought. It is the tree down which the dead Pakal falls on his sarcophagus lid, toward the underworld and the promise of rebirth. It is the cross-shaped image at the center of the great tablets of Palenque. It is figured in the very layout of the cities, the temples as sacred mountains, the plazas as the surface of the world, the whole built environment a model of the cosmos, a place where the king could stand at the center, at the foot of the world tree, and join the 3 worlds in his own sacred person. To be the king was to be the world tree, the living axis joining the human world to the worlds above and below, the channel through which the sacred flowed, the center that held the cosmos together. And the way the king opened that channel, the way he fed the gods and joined the worlds and kept the whole sacred order turning, was through blood, his own blood, given in the most sacred and the most painful of all the Maya rituals. To the bloodletting of the kings, and the vision serpent, and the terrible intimacy of the Maya relationship with their gods, we turn now. The Maya gods were not distant. They were not abstract principles or remote creators who set the world in motion and withdrew. They were present, immediate, demanding, and hungry. And what they hungered for was blood, the precious fluid of life, the substance that human beings and gods shared, and that bound them together in a relationship of mutual obligation and mutual need. The gods had given their own blood, in the beginning, to create human beings and to set the world in motion. And human beings in return owed the gods blood, owed them the nourishment that kept them strong, kept them present, kept the sun moving, and the rain falling, and the maize growing, and the whole sacred order turning. This is the dark and intimate heart of Maya religion, and there is no understanding the civilization without facing it honestly, that they believed the cosmos ran on blood, and that it was the sacred duty of human beings, and above all of the king, to provide it. For the king, this meant bloodletting, the ritual offering of his own blood, drawn from his own body in ceremonies of extraordinary pain and power. The king would pierce himself, the earlobes, the tongue, and, most agonizingly, the genitals, with a sharp instrument, a stingray spine, an obsidian blade, a sharpened bone, drawing the blood and letting it fall onto strips of bark paper, which were then burned, the smoke carrying the offering up to the gods. The royal women did this too. One of the most famous of all Maya carvings, a lintel from the city of Yaxchilan, shows a queen, Lady Kibel Zook, drawing a thorn-studded rope through her own pierced tongue, the blood falling onto the paper in the basket before her, in one of the great ritual images of the ancient world, an act of devotion and power and almost unimaginable pain, performed by a queen for the welfare of her kingdom and the nourishment of her gods. And the purpose of this agony, beyond the feeding of the gods, was vision. For the Maya believed that through the pain and the blood loss and the smoke and the ritual, in the altered state that such an ordeal induces, the boundary between the worlds grew thin, and the one who let blood could see, could call up from the smoke of the burning blood the vision serpent, a great undulating supernatural serpent that rose from the offering, and from whose open jaws emerged the gods and the ancestors, summoned back across the boundary of death to speak with the living. The next lintel in that same series at Yaxchilan shows exactly this. The queen, having let her blood, gazing up at the vision serpent rising before her, an ancestor or a god emerging from its mouth. This was the deepest purpose of the royal bloodletting. Not merely to feed the gods, but to open the channel, to part the veil, to summon the ancestors and the gods into the presence of the living, so that the king, the world tree, the axis joining the worlds, could commune directly with the sacred powers on whom the kingdom depended and bring back their guidance and their blessing. The blood was the price of the vision. The pain was the doorway, and the king who could endure it, who could open his own body and summon the serpent and speak with the gods, was the king who held the cosmos together, who justified his sacred role, who proved before his people that he was indeed the Holy Lord, the living link to the other world. And there was, beyond the king's own blood, the blood of others, the sacrifice of captives, of prisoners of war, of the defeated kings and nobles taken in the endless wars between the kingdoms. This is the darkest aspect of the Maya world, and it would be false to the truth to soften it. Captured enemies, especially high-ranking ones, were sacrificed to the gods, sometimes after long humiliation and torture, sometimes by decapitation, sometimes in connection with the ballgame and its reenactment of the cosmic contest with death. The taking of a high-ranking captive was one of the great achievements a Maya king could boast of, recorded with pride on the monuments. The captive shown bound and stripped and humiliated at the king's feet, named and dated, his capture and sacrifice, a demonstration of the king's power, and a feeding of the gods in one. War, for the Maya, was bound up with sacrifice. One of its central purposes was the taking of captives for the altar, and the sacred and the violent were woven together as tightly here as anywhere in the human record. The same civilization that calculated the cycle of Venus and invented the concept of zero and carved the most beautiful art of the ancient Americas also believed that the sun would not rise and the rain would not fall unless the gods were fed with human blood, and acted on that belief, century after century, in the plazas before the temples, under the same stars they tracked with such patient genius. To look at the Maya honestly is to hold both of these truths at once, without letting go of either. The beauty and the blood, the science and the sacrifice, the calculation of the heavens and the opening of the body, all of it one civilization, one way of being human in the world. The Maya left us many things, but they left us only one great work of their literature nearly whole. And it is one of the masterpieces of the human imagination, a creation epic of extraordinary beauty and strangeness and power, preserved by something close to a miracle through the very conquest that destroyed almost everything else. It is the Popol Vuh, the Book of the Community, or Book of the Council, the sacred narrative of the Quiché Maya of the Guatemalan highlands, and it is the closest thing we have to a Maya Bible, a Maya Homer, the great story they told about the creation of the world and the origin of human beings, and the deeds of the gods and heroes at the dawn of time. It survived because, in the middle of the 16th century, after the Spanish conquest, some unknown member of the Quiché nobility, literate now in the Latin alphabet that the missionaries had taught, but still holding the old knowledge, wrote down the ancient story in the Quiché language, using Spanish letters, preserving in writing what had been, for the Maya, partly an oral tradition, and partly recorded in the painted books that were even then being burned. That manuscript was later copied by a Spanish friar, Francisco Ximenez, in the early 18th century, who recorded the Quiché text alongside a Spanish translation, and through his copy, the Popol Vuh survived, when so much else was lost, to be read and translated and treasured by the modern world as the supreme surviving work of Maya literature. It is a window, however partial, into the mythology that underlay the whole civilization, the stories the carved monuments allude to, the cosmos the kings embodied, the sacred narrative that gave meaning to the bloodletting and the ballgame and the maze. It begins, like the greatest creation stories, in emptiness, in a world that is only sky and sea, still and silent and empty. In the darkness before the dawn, the gods alone in the primordial water, contemplating the creation of the world. And the gods speak, and by their word the earth rises from the sea, the mountains and the valleys and the forests and the rivers, and they make the animals, the deer and the birds and the jaguars. But the animals cannot speak, cannot praise their makers, cannot keep the days or honor the gods. And so the gods resolve to make a being that can. They try first to make people of mud, but the mud people dissolve and crumble, formless, unable to multiply or to think. They try next to make people of wood, and the wood people walk and talk and multiply and fill the earth. But they have no hearts, no minds, no memory of their makers, no blood. They are empty, soulless, and they do not honor the gods, and so the gods destroy them in a great flood and a rain of resin, and the very animals and household objects of the wood people rise up against them in their destruction. A strange and haunting passage, the dogs and the grinding stones and the cooking pots taking revenge on the soulless wooden people for their mistreatment. And the survivors of the wood people, the story says, became the monkeys of the forest, which is why the monkeys look a little like us and live in the trees, the failed first draft of humanity. And then, at the center of the Popol Vuh, comes the great myth. The story of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Palenque, the two young gods whose deeds in the underworld are the heart of the whole epic, and the central drama of Maya religion. Their story is long and intricate and full of wonders, and we will follow it through the night dark of the forest, because it is the key to so much, to the ball game, to the sacrifice, to the maze, to the Maya understanding of death and rebirth and the cosmos itself. It begins with the twins' father and uncle, who were also twins, and who were great ball players, and who played so loudly that they disturbed the lords of Xibalba, the gods of death in the underworld, who summoned them down to the underworld to play, and there defeated them through trickery and sacrificed them, burying their bodies beneath the ball court, and hanging the head of the father in a calabash tree as a warning. But the severed head, hanging in the tree, was still potent, and when a daughter of one of the lords of death came to look at the strange fruit, the skull spat into her hand, and she conceived, and fled the underworld to the surface of the earth, and there gave birth to the hero twins, Hunahpu and Palenque, the sons of the murdered ball player, born to avenge their father, and to defeat death itself. The hero twins grew up on the surface of the earth, and like their father before them they became great ball players, and like their father they played so loudly that the lords of Xibalba, the gods of death, were disturbed in the underworld and summoned them down to play, exactly as they had summoned the father, intending to trick and kill the sons as they had tricked and killed the father. But the twins were cleverer than their father had been, and their journey down into Xibalba and their contest with the lords of death is one of the great descent myths of world literature, a story of cunning and courage and sacrifice that sits beside the descents of Orpheus and Inanna, and every hero who ever went down into death and came back changed. The road to Xibalba was full of traps and tests, and the twins passed them through cleverness. The lords of death set them riddles and ordeals designed to destroy them. They had to survive a series of terrible houses, each one a different death: the dark house, full of blackness; the cold house, full of freezing hail; the jaguar house, full of ravening cats; the fire house, and the bat house, full of shrieking death bats with blades for noses. The road to Xibalba was full of traps and tests, and the twins passed them through cleverness. The lords of death set them riddles and ordeals designed to destroy them. They had to survive a series of terrible houses, each one a different death: the dark house, full of blackness; the cold house, full of freezing hail; the jaguar house, full of ravening cats; the fire house, and the bat house, full of shrieking death bats with blades for noses. Through trick after trick the twins survived the houses, but in the bat house, Hunahpu put his head out at the wrong moment, and a great bat swept down and cut off his head, and the lords of death seized the head in triumph and hung it over the ball court to use as the ball in the next day's game. And here the story turns to its strangest and most wonderful invention. For Palenque, the surviving twin, gathered the animals of the forest to help him, and from a carved squash he fashioned a substitute head for his brother. And in the great game against the lords of death, when the real head of Hunahpu was knocked out of the court, a rabbit, sent by the twins, bounded away pretending to be the ball, and in the confusion Palenque retrieved his brother's true head and restored it to his body, and substituted the squash as the ball, and the twins won the game against death itself, the lords of Xibalba batting a squash around their own ball court, without realizing the trick. But the twins knew they could not simply leave. that the Lords of Death would never truly let them go, that death cannot be merely escaped, but must be defeated, overcome, transformed. And so they devised the most extraordinary of all their tricks. Knowing that the Lords of Death were curious and proud, the twins began to perform miracles. They would sacrifice each other, and then bring each other back to life, killing and reviving, dancing the dance of death and resurrection before the astonished Lords of Xibalba. They burned a house and made it whole. They sacrificed a dog and revived it. And at last, in the supreme performance, Palenque sacrificed Hunahapu, cut him apart, took out his heart, and then brought him back to life, whole and laughing. And the Lords of Death, delighted, amazed, consumed with the desire to experience this wonder themselves, demanded that the twins do it to them. "Sacrifice us," they cried, "and bring us back. Let us feel the miracle." And the twins obliged. They sacrificed the two highest Lords of Death, and did not bring them back. The trick was complete. Death itself had asked to be killed, and the twins had granted the wish, and Death stayed dead. The remaining Lords of Xibalba, terrified, surrendered, and the twins decreed that from then on the power of the underworld would be limited, that the Lords of Death would no longer have the unlimited dominion they had held, that they would receive only the unworthy and the guilty, that their reign of terror over humanity was broken. The hero twins had gone down into death and defeated it, not by escaping it, but by mastering it, by passing through it and turning it against itself, by transforming death from an absolute power into something that could be overcome. And then the twins rose, up out of the underworld, up into the sky, where they became, the story says, the sun and the moon, the lights of heaven, the children of the dawn. Their victory over death made possible the world that was to come, the world of true human beings, who could now be created at last, because death had been mastered and the cosmos set in order. And so the gods, after the failures of the mud people and the wood people, made the first true human beings, and they made them, as we have seen, out of maize, grinding white and yellow corn into meal, and forming from it the flesh of the first four men, the ancestors of the Maya, beings of maize, who could speak and think and remember and honor their makers, who could keep the days and track the heavens and feed the gods, who were, at last, the people the gods had been trying to make since the beginning of the world. The people of maize, the keepers of time, the Maya. It is one of the great myths of humanity, the Popol Vuh, a story of creation and destruction and recreation, of the defeat of death and the triumph of cleverness over power, of human beings made from the staple grain that fed them, woven through with the deepest themes of Maya life, the ball game as the contest with death, the sacrifice and resurrection that the kings reenacted in their bloodletting, the maize that was the substance of both the gods and the people, the descent into the underworld, and the rising again that the sun performed each day, and the maize each year, and that every Maya hoped, in some form, to perform after death. To know the Popol Vuh is to hold the key to the whole Maya cosmos, and to possess, as well, simply one of the most beautiful stories the human species has ever told, preserved against all odds through the wreck of the Conquest, carried down to us across the centuries, the surviving voice of a literature almost entirely lost. We have spent much of the night among kings and gods, in the palaces and the temples and the underworld, because that is where the monuments and the myths lead us. But the kings were a tiny fraction of the Maya, the gleaming apex of a vast pyramid of ordinary human lives, and the civilization rested, as every civilization rests, on the broad patient base of the common people, the farmers, the weavers, the potters, the builders, the merchants, the mothers and fathers and children who made up the overwhelming majority of the Maya world, and whose lives, though they left few monuments, were the real substance of the civilization. Let us come down, now, from the temple summit into the ordinary settlements, and spend an hour with the people of Maize as they actually lived. The typical Maya did not live in the monumental center of a city, among the temples and palaces, but in the surrounding residential zones and the countryside, in households of pole and thatch houses, much like the houses many rural Maya still build today, clustered around small courtyards, grouped into extended family compounds, spread out across the landscape among the milpas and the orchards and the managed forest. The house was a simple, elegant, beautifully adapted structure, a framework of wooden poles, walls of wattle or stone, a steep thatched roof of palm leaves that shed the tropical rain and let the smoke of the cooking fire filter out, the whole thing cool and dry and durable in the hot, wet climate. Beneath the floor, often, the family buried its dead, the ancestors remaining literally part of the household, present beneath the feet of the living, honored and consulted and fed with offerings, the dead and the living sharing the home across the generations. The work of life was, above all, the work of maize. The men cleared and burned and planted and tended the milpa, the cycle of the agricultural year structuring the whole of life, the planting and the growing and the harvest woven into the calendar and the ritual and the very myths of the people of corn. And the women. The women's work was endless and essential, and, in its way, as skilled as any in the society. Above all there was the grinding of the maize, for maize, to be eaten, must be processed, and the Maya had discovered, in the deep past, a chemical technique of extraordinary importance called nixtamalization, soaking and cooking the dried maize kernels in water mixed with lime or ash, which softens the grain, makes it grindable, and, crucially, unlocks nutrients in the maize that are otherwise unavailable to the human body, including niacin, the lack of which causes the deadly deficiency disease pellagra. Without nixtamalization, a people living mainly on maize would sicken and die. With it, maize becomes a far more complete food. The Maya discovered this as the other maize peoples of the Americas discovered it, and it was the women who did the work, soaking and cooking the maize, then grinding it for hours on the stone metate with the stone mano, kneeling, pushing the stone back and forth, turning the treated maize into the dough from which the tortillas and the tamales and the gruel were made, the daily bread of the civilization. Hours of hard, skilled labor every single day, in every household, for the whole of Maya history, the invisible foundation, the endless grinding of the corn, without which none of the temples could have risen. The women wove too, and Maya weaving was a high art, the women working the backstrap loom, the loom tied at one end to a tree or post, and at the other around the weaver's own back, so that she controlled the tension with the movement of her own body, weaving the cotton into cloth of astonishing intricacy and beauty, dyed with the colors of the forest and the famous deep purple of a particular sea snail, and the brilliant blue the Maya alone knew how to make, patterned with designs of deep meaning and great antiquity, designs that the modern Maya weavers still work, in an unbroken tradition reaching back across the centuries. The cloth they wove was wealth, was tribute, was art, was identity. Each community, each region, its own patterns and colors, so that a person's clothing announced who they were and where they came from, as the traditional Maya textiles still do today. The patient labor of the women, the grinding and the weaving, the cooking and the child-rearing, and the keeping of the household, and the honoring of the ancestors beneath the floor, was the true foundation of the civilization, as the patient labor of women has been the true foundation of every civilization, and it is right, in the quiet of the forest night, to remember them. The countless generations of Maya women, kneeling at the grinding stone in the dawn light, turning the maize into the food that fed the kings and the gods, and the whole bright, fragile edifice of the classic Maya world. The Maya world was bound together, and bound to the wider world of Mesoamerica, by trade, by the constant movement of goods across the forest and the highlands and the coasts, carried on the backs of human porters along forest trails and by canoe along the rivers and around the coasts, for the Maya had no draft animals and no wheeled vehicles for transport, and so every load moved either by water or on a human back. There were no pack animals in the Americas, no horses, no oxen, no donkeys, none of the beasts of burden that moved the goods of the old world, and so the whole vast commerce of the Maya world rested, like so much else, on human labor. The porters, the canoe paddlers, the merchants who walked the forest roads with their goods, the trade networks that reached from the highlands to the coasts and across the whole of Mesoamerica, and what they traded reveals the values of their world. From the highlands came obsidian, the volcanic glass for blades and tools, and jade, the green stone prized above all else. From the coasts came salt, essential and much traded, produced by evaporation along the shores, and shells, and stingray spines for bloodletting, and the shark teeth and coral of the sea. From the forest came the feathers of the quetzal, the brilliant green tail feathers of the resplendent quetzal, the sacred bird of the cloud forest, feathers reserved for royalty, worn in the great headdresses of the kings, so precious that to kill the bird was sometimes forbidden. The feathers plucked from the living quetzal, and the bird released. From the forest too came jaguar pelts, the skin of the great cat, the royal animal, the creature of the night and the underworld and kingly power. There were textiles, the woven cloth that was both art and currency. There was pottery, the painted ceramics that were traded across the whole region. There was rubber and copal incense, the sacred resin burned in vast quantities in every temple and household. the smoke that fed the gods. And there was the most precious and most charged of all the trade goods, the one that would, in time, conquer the world. Cacao. Cacao, the bean of the cacao tree, from which we make chocolate, was, to the Maya and the other peoples of Mesoamerica, far more than a food. It was sacred. It was wealth. It was, quite literally, money. The cacao tree grows only in particular warm, wet lowland regions, and its beans were prized throughout Mesoamerica, traded across the whole region, and used as currency, a standardized, countable, portable form of wealth, so that you could buy goods, pay tribute, settle debts in cacao beans, the chocolate money of the ancient Americas. The Spanish, when they arrived, recorded the prices of things in cacao beans, so many beans for a turkey, so many for a rabbit, so many for the services of a porter, and noted, with a mixture of amazement and contempt, that the natives used as money the very beans from which they made their strange bitter drink, and the drink itself was the heart of the matter. For the Maya took the cacao beans, fermented and dried and roasted and ground them, and made from them a drink, not the sweet milky chocolate of the modern world, but a bitter, frothy, intensely flavoured beverage, often spiced with chili and other flavourings, poured from height to raise a thick foam that was the most prized part, drunk from beautiful painted vessels, reserved largely for the elite, for the nobility and royalty, consumed at feasts and rituals and the great ceremonies of the court. Cacao was the drink of kings and gods. The painted vessels that held it are among the masterpieces of Maya ceramic art, often inscribed in the glyphs, with the very word for cacao and the name of the vessel's royal owner and the kind of chocolate it was meant to hold. The word cacao itself, and through it our word chocolate, descends from the languages of ancient Mesoamerica, one of the most delicious gifts the Maya world gave to the rest of humanity, the sacred bitter drink of the forest kings, transformed across the centuries into the chocolate that the whole world now craves. Few of its consumers are aware that they are tasting, however changed, the money and the sacrament of the ancient Maya. We tend to see the Maya in stone, the grey weathered pyramids, the carved monuments, the colourless ruins as the jungle and the centuries left them. But this is a profound distortion of how the Maya actually saw their own world, and we must correct it in the imagination before the night ends, because the Maya world was not grey. It was a riot of colour, painted and brilliant, vivid almost beyond the modern imagination. And to picture the ruins as they truly were in their living days is to transform them utterly. The pyramids and temples were not bare stone. They were covered in plaster and painted. Painted, above all, a brilliant, deep red, the sacred colour, so that the great temple mountains rose above the forest, not grey but blood red, blazing in the tropical sun, trimmed and detailed in other colours, the carved stucco facades of gods and symbols picked out in blue and yellow and green. The cities were red cities, vivid against the green of the forest, a sight that no surviving ruin can convey, for the paint and plaster have long since weathered away, leaving only the grey stone bones of what was once a brilliantly coloured world. Imagine Tikal not grey, but red, the great temples blazing crimson above the canopy, the plazas plastered white and gleaming, the whole city a vivid painted assertion of colour and life and sacred power against the green wall of the forest. That is closer to the truth than the grey ruins we see today, and the art that survives, where it survives protected from the weather, confirms the brilliance. The greatest treasure is the murals of Bonampak, a small site in the Yup'as forest where, in a modest 3-room building, the Maya painted, around the year 790, near the very end of the Classic period, a series of murals that are the finest surviving paintings of the ancient Maya and among the masterpieces of all ancient American art. The Bonampak murals cover the walls and vaulted ceilings of the 3 rooms in continuous painted scenes, vivid with colour and crowded with figures, and they show the Maya world as nothing else does, a great ceremony with musicians and dancers and lords in magnificent costume, a battle, ferocious and chaotic, the warriors in jaguar pelts and feathers seizing their captives, and the aftermath, the arraignment and sacrifice of the prisoners before the enthroned king, the captives bleeding, one already dead, the brutal reality of Maya power rendered in unflinching colour. The murals are a revelation. They show us the colour, the costume, the music, the dance, the warfare, the sacrifice, the whole vivid pageant of the late classic court, frozen on the walls of a forgotten building in the forest, the closest thing we have to a window onto the living Maya world in motion. And they were painted, poignantly, around the year 790, just as the great collapse was beginning, just before this whole brilliant world began to come apart. a last magnificent flowering of Maya art on the very edge of the catastrophe. Beyond the murals, the Maya painted their books, now almost all lost. They painted their pottery, the great tradition of painted ceramics that decorated the vessels of the elite with scenes of myth and court life and the gods, scenes that have become, since they can now partly be read and interpreted, one of our richest sources for Maya mythology and daily life. The so-called codex-style vases in particular, painted in fine line like the lost books, preserving on fired clay images that the burned codices would otherwise have taken with them into oblivion. And they made, famously, a colour the modern world had to rediscover, Maya blue, a brilliant, durable, astonishingly stable blue pigment, made by a chemical combination of indigo dye and a particular clay mineral, fixed by heat into a colour that has survived centuries of tropical weather without fading, still vivid on the murals and pottery and sculpture where ordinary pigments have long since vanished. A blue so stable that modern chemists studied it for years to understand its secret, a triumph of Maya materials science, the sacred colour of the rain god and sacrifice, the blue in which the victims were sometimes painted before they were given to the gods. The Maya world was a painted world, a coloured world, a brilliant world, and the grey ruins we walk today are like the bleached bones of something that was, in life, as vivid and as colourful as the quetzal and the macaw and the flowers of the forest from which it drew its sacred reds and blues and greens. For a long time, the recovered history of the Maya was a history of kings, of the holy lords whose deeds filled the monuments, the male rulers whose accessions and wars and rituals the glyphs recorded. But as the decipherment deepened, women began to emerge from the stone, queens, royal mothers, great ladies whose power and importance the inscriptions had recorded all along. Once we learnt to read them, and who turn out to have played roles in the Maya political world, far greater than the old king-centered picture had allowed. The women of the Maya court were not merely consorts and mothers. Some of them were rulers in their own right, holding power, waging war, founding dynasties, their names and deeds carved into the monuments beside and sometimes above those of the men. We have already met one, Lady Kabal Zook of Yaxchilan, the queen drawing the thorn rope through her tongue in the great bloodletting lintel, performing the most sacred and painful of royal rituals, her devotion and her power recorded forever in one of the masterpieces of Maya art. But there were others, and some of them ruled. At the city of Palenque, Pakal the Great himself came to the throne through his mother, the Queen Sak-Kuk, who appears to have held royal power herself in the difficult years before her son's accession, ruling in her own right in a time of crisis, and from whom Pakal derived his contested but ultimately triumphant claim. At the small but fierce kingdom of Naranjo, a great lady named Lady Six Sky, Ix-Wak-Chan Ajan, a princess from the powerful snake kingdom of Calakmul, arrived to refound a defeated dynasty, and ruled, and waged war, and raised monuments in her own image standing on the bodies of captives in the posture of a conquering king, and installed her young son on the throne, and governed through and beside him. One of the most powerful figures in the Maya world of her day, a woman who held and wielded the power of a king in all but name, and perhaps in name as well. These royal women married across the kingdoms, binding the dynasties together in the great web of Maya alliance and rivalry. A princess of Calakmul to a king of Yaxchilan, a great lady travelling to a distant city to refound its line, the marriages of the royal women, a central instrument of Maya statecraft. Weaving the kingdoms together and apart in the endless political dance, they performed the sacred rituals, let their blood, danced as the gods, bore and raised the heirs on whom the dynasties depended, and sometimes ruled outright, and their emergence from the stone, as the glyphs gave up their secrets, is one of the quiet revolutions in our understanding of the Maya. The recognition that this was not simply a world of warrior kings, but a world in which women of the royal houses held real and recorded power, founded and saved dynasties, waged wars and built monuments, and stood, some of them, at the very summit of the sacred order, holy lords in their own right, the world tree joining the worlds in a woman's sacred person as in a man's. And now we come to the heart of the mystery, the thing that, more than the pyramids or the calendar or the writing, has made the Maya a byword for the enigmatic and the lost, the classic Maya collapse, the catastrophe that, across roughly the 9th century of the Common Era, brought the whole brilliant civilization of the southern lowlands to an end, emptied the great cities one after another, silenced the carving of the monuments, and left Tikal and Palenque and Copan and 100 other kingdoms to the forest and the dark. It is one of the most studied and most debated events in all of archaeology, and after more than a century of investigation, the honest answer to the question, why did the Maya collapse, is still in its deepest form. We are not entirely certain, but we have learnt a great deal, and the picture that has emerged is less a single dramatic cause than a convergence of pressures, a perfect storm of troubles falling on a civilization that had, perhaps, grown too large and too rigid and too dependent on a fragile environment to absorb them. Let us be precise about what the collapse was and was not. It was not the end of the Maya. We have said this, and we will say it again, because it is the thing most easily misunderstood. The people did not vanish. The Maya survived. Millions of them live today. Nor was it sudden, a single catastrophe in a single year. It was a process, spread across roughly a century or more, affecting different cities at different times, a rolling cascade of decline and abandonment moving across the southern lowlands. And it was not universal. The collapse struck the southern lowland heartland, the country of Tikal and the great classic cities, while in the northern Yucatan other cities, Chichen Itza above all, were rising to new heights at the very time the southern cities were falling. The collapse was the end of a particular world, the classic lowland world of the divine kings and the carved monuments and the great forest cities, not the end of Maya civilization as a whole, which continued, transformed, in the north and would continue, transformed again, through the Spanish conquest and down to the present day. But within its own sphere, in the southern lowlands, the collapse was real and profound and final. The cities emptied, the population fell by perhaps 90% or more across the worst affected regions. The institution of divine kingship vanished, the monuments ceased, and the great forest closed over the works of the classic Maya, not to be disturbed again for 1,000 years. What we can read in the monuments themselves is the slow falling silent. The classic Maya dated their monuments with such precision that we can watch the collapse happen, city by city, in the dates of the last carved stones. Through the 8th century, the cities raised monuments as they always had, the kings recording their deeds in the unbroken rhythm of the long count. And then, one by one, the cities go quiet. The last dated monument at one city falls in 810, at another in 822, at another in 849, the latest of all at the small site of Tonea in 909, and then nothing, silence, no more carved dates anywhere in the southern lowlands. The long tradition of Maya monumental inscription, sustained for 6 centuries, simply ending, city by city, as the kingdoms failed and the kings fell and the scribes who carved the glyphs put down their tools for the last time. To read the collapse in the dates of the last monuments is to watch a civilization fall silent in slow motion across 100 years. The great cities going dark one after another, the carved record thinning and ceasing, the final dates like the last entries in a journal that simply stops, midlife, with no closing word. So what happened? The theories have been many, and the older ones, sudden epidemic, foreign invasion, peasant revolt, earthquake, have mostly given way, as the evidence has accumulated, to a more complex and in some ways more disturbing picture. That the classic Maya collapse was, at its root, an environmental and demographic catastrophe, brought on partly by the Maya themselves, and triggered or worsened by a profound and prolonged natural disaster, drought. Consider first what the centuries of success had produced. The classic Maya population had grown, across 600 years of flourishing, to enormous size, millions of people across the southern lowlands, packed into the cities and their hinterlands at densities the fragile tropical environment could barely sustain. To feed that population, the Maya had pushed their agriculture to its limits and beyond, clearing more and more forest for milpa, shortening the fallow periods that let the soil recover, terracing the hillsides and draining the swamps, cultivating ever more marginal land. The deforestation was massive. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment show the forest stripped away across vast areas, the land laid bare to feed the cities, and deforestation on that scale brings consequences. Erosion, as the rains wash the thin soil off the cleared hillsides into the valleys and swamps. Declining fertility, as the overworked land gives less and less, and, the studies increasingly suggest, changes to the local climate itself, the stripping of the forest reducing rainfall and raising temperatures, the Maya unknowingly degrading the very environment on which they depended. The skeletons of the late classic population, at Copan and elsewhere, show the marks of this strain. Increasing malnutrition, disease, declining stature and health across the generations, the bones recording a population pressing ever harder against the limits of what its land could provide. And onto this strained, overpopulated, environmentally degraded world fell the drought. The evidence for it has grown steadily and is now strong. Records from lake sediments, from cave formations, from the chemistry of the deposits that build up year by year and preserve the signature of ancient rainfall, and they point to a series of severe, prolonged droughts striking the Maya lowlands across exactly the period of the collapse, the 9th century, some of the worst dry spells in thousands of years, falling on a civilization in a land that, as we have seen, had no rivers, that depended on the rains and the reservoirs, that had already pushed its water systems and its agriculture to the edge. For a civilization living on captured rainwater in a land without rivers, a multi-year drought was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The reservoirs emptied, the milpas failed, the cities, packed with people who could no longer be fed or watered, became death traps, and the elaborate social and religious order, the divine kings whose central promise was to bring the rain and ensure the harvest through their rituals and their sacrifices, failed its fundamental test, for the kings let their blood and summoned the vision serpent and danced as the rain god. And still the rain did not come, and the legitimacy of the whole sacred order, built on the king's power to keep the cosmos turning, collapsed along with the harvests. And here the human factors compound the natural ones. As the droughts struck and the harvests failed and the population starved, the competition between the kingdoms, always intense, seems to have turned increasingly desperate and destructive, the warfare escalating as the kingdoms fought over dwindling resources, the late monuments and the archaeology showing increasing conflict, defensive walls thrown up around cities that had never needed them, the signs of violence and burning and hasty abandonment, the social order frayed, the faith in the divine kings, who had failed to bring the rain, broke. The people, starving and losing faith, and caught in escalating war, did what people do when the center cannot hold. They left. They abandoned the cities, dispersed into the countryside, migrated to regions less affected, drifted away from the failed centers of the old order, and the great cities, deprived of the populations that had sustained them, fell silent and empty. The kings gone, the scribes gone, the people scattered, the forest beginning, season by season, to creep back over the plazas and climb the pyramids and swallow the works of the classic Maya world. It was not one cause, it was all of them together. Overpopulation, environmental degradation, drought, warfare, and the collapse of faith in a sacred order that had failed its central promise. A convergence of pressures that no civilization, however brilliant, could have withstood, falling on a world that had perhaps grown too large and too rigid and too dependent on a fragile balance to bend without breaking. The Maya had built a magnificent civilization in an impossible place, and sustained it for 600 years through ingenuity and effort and faith, and in the end the impossible place, pushed too far and struck by the drought, took it back. While the southern cities fell silent, something remarkable was happening in the north. For the collapse, as we have said, was not the end of the Maya, and even as Tikal and Copan and Palenque emptied into the forest, the northern Yucatan was entering a new age of greatness, dominated by a city whose name has become, for many people, almost synonymous with the Maya themselves. Chichén Itzá, the great post-classic capital, the city of the feathered serpent and the sacred well, and the pyramid where the shadow snake descends, one of the most famous and most visited ancient sites in all of the Americas, and one of the most fascinating, because it represents a Maya world transformed. Chichén Itzá rose to dominance across the period when the southern cities were collapsing, and after, through the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries, becoming the greatest power in the northern lowlands, a city that drew on the old Maya traditions, but fused them with powerful new influences from central Mexico, from the world of the Toltecs and the great Mexican civilizations to the west, producing a hybrid culture and a hybrid art unlike anything in the classic South. The most famous building, the Great Pyramid the Spanish called El Castillo, the castle, and the Maya knew as the Temple of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, is the very image of Chichen Itza, a great four-sided stepped pyramid, severe and geometric, rising in 9 terraces to the temple at its summit, with a broad staircase climbing each of its 4 faces. And the pyramid is, like so much in the Maya world, a calendar in stone, a machine for marking sacred time. Its 4 staircases have 91 steps each, which with the top platform make 365, the days of the solar year. Its terraces and panels encode other calendrical counts. The whole structure is an embodiment of the Maya obsession with time, built into architecture. And twice a year, at the equinoxes, the temple of Kukulkan performs a wonder, that draws crowds from across the world to this day. In the late afternoon of the equinox, as the sun sinks, the stepped edge of the pyramid's northwest side casts a shadow onto the side of the northern staircase. A shadow broken by the steps into a series of triangles, a zigzag of light and shadow running down the edge of the great stair, and at the foot of that staircase, carved in stone, is the head of a great serpent. As the sun moves and the shadow lengthens and shifts, the zigzag of light appears to connect to the carved serpent head, so that for a little while, on the afternoon of the equinox, a great serpent of light and shadow seems to descend the staircase of the pyramid. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, descending from the temple to the earth, the god come down to his people on the day the Maya astronomers had so precisely fixed, the whole pyramid revealed as an instrument designed across decades of patient observation to capture the equinox sun and make it perform the descent of the god. It is one of the most spectacular marriages of astronomy and architecture and religion the ancient world produced. The god appearing, on the appointed day, summoned not by magic, but by the precise alignment of stone and sun that the Maya had calculated and built, the shadow serpent descending the stair, as it has descended every equinox for 1,000 years, indifferent to the collapse of empires, keeping its appointment with the sun. And beside the Great Pyramid lies the other defining feature of Chichen Itza, the thing that gave the city its name and its dark fame, the sacred cenote, the great natural well, a vast round sinkhole some 60 meters across, its sheer limestone walls dropping 20 meters or more to the dark green water far below. This was the most sacred of the cenotes, a doorway to the underworld and the realm of the rain god, and to it the Maya brought offerings, and not only offerings of jade and gold and copper and incense, though they brought those in abundance, but offerings of human beings, victims cast into the deep water as gifts to the gods, especially, the traditions say, in times of drought, when the rain god had to be propitiated, and the water that would not fall from the sky was sought in the sacred well that led down to the watery underworld where the rain was born. When the cenote was dredged and explored in the modern age, its bottom gave up the proof of the old accounts, a treasure of jade and gold and copal incense and other precious offerings, and among them the bones of the sacrificed, men, women, and a great many children, given to the dark water across the centuries, cast into the sacred well to carry the prayers of the living down to the gods of rain and death in the underworld below. The sacred cenote of Chichen Itza is one of the places where the beauty and the darkness of the Maya world meet most starkly, the holy doorway to the underworld, the source of the precious water in a dry land, and the place where, in the extremity of drought, human beings were given to the deep to beg the gods for rain. Chichen Itza itself declined eventually, around the 13th century, its power passing to a new center, Mayapan, which dominated the northern Yucatan for a time as a kind of last echo of Maya urban civilization, a walled city, more crowded and less grand than the great centers of old, ruling a confederation of the northern Maya before it too fell, around the middle of the 15th century, to internal strife and the endless factional warfare that the Maya political world never escaped. By the time the strangers came, by the time the first Europeans appeared off the coasts of the Maya world in the early 16th century, the great age of Maya cities was long past. There was no Maya empire to conquer, no single great capital to seize, no king of kings whose capture would deliver the whole civilization, as the Spanish had found among the Aztecs of central Mexico and would find among the Inca of Peru. Instead, the Maya world was what it had always been at heart, a patchwork of small kingdoms and chiefdoms and city-states, divided, mutually hostile, scattered across the forests and the highlands and the northern plains. And this very disunity, which had been the weakness of the Maya in their golden age, became, paradoxically, the source of one of the most stubborn and prolonged resistances to European conquest anywhere in the Americas, for there was no center to seize, no single blow that could topple the whole. The Spanish, arriving in the Yucatan in the 1520s and 30s, expecting another swift conquest like that of the Aztec Empire, instead found themselves drawn into a grinding, decades-long struggle against dozens of separate Maya polities, each one having to be subdued in turn, the conquest dragging on for the better part of 20 years before the northern Yucatan was brought under Spanish control, and even then incompletely, with revolts and resistance continuing for generations. And in the deep forests of the Petén, in the old southern heartland, one Maya kingdom held out far longer still, the Itzá kingdom of Nojpetén, on an island in a lake deep in the Guatemalan forest, the last independent Maya state, which did not fall to the Spanish until the year 1697, more than 170 years after the conquest began, nearly 2 centuries after Columbus, a Maya kingdom still independent, still ruled by its own lords, still worshipping its own gods on its forest island. While in Europe Isaac Newton was alive and the modern age was dawning, the last Maya kingdom fell only at the very end of the 17th century, a fact that astonishes most people. So accustomed are we to imagining the Maya as a civilization of the deep and vanished past, when in truth the last independent Maya state outlasted the founding of Boston and Philadelphia, and survived into the lifetime of people whose grandchildren would see the American Revolution. The conquest, where it came, was a catastrophe, as it was everywhere in the Americas, and for the same overwhelming reason, disease. The Maya, like all the peoples of the Americas, had no immunity to the diseases the Europeans brought: smallpox, measles, influenza, the whole arsenal of Old World plagues against which the isolated populations of the New World had no defense, and these diseases swept through the Maya world, as through all of the Americas, with a mortality almost impossible to comprehend, killing not thousands but millions, perhaps 90% of the population in the worst-hit regions, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in human history, emptying the land more thoroughly than any war. The diseases often ran ahead of the conquerors themselves, carried by trade and contact, so that many Maya communities were devastated by plague before they ever saw a Spaniard. Against this biological catastrophe, no courage and no resistance and no disunity or unity could have availed. The Maya world that the Spanish conquered and ruled was already a world hollowed out by death, its population shattered, its old order broken not only by the sword, but by the invisible plagues that the strangers carried in their bodies without even knowing it. Among the many tragedies of the conquest, one stands out as a wound to human knowledge itself, an act of destruction so complete and so consequential that it impoverished the whole future understanding of the Maya, and it was carried out by a single man, in a single place, on a single day, in the name of God. The man was Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar who came to the Yucatan in the years after the conquest to convert the Maya to Christianity, and who became in time the Bishop of the Yucatan, and who is, in the strange way that history works, both the greatest destroyer of Maya knowledge and one of its most important preservers, a man whose single act of zealotry annihilated a library and whose single act of curiosity saved the key that would one day help unlock what he had tried to destroy. In the year 1562, in the town of Mani, Landa, horrified to discover that the Maya, whom he had believed converted, were still secretly practicing their old religion, still worshipping their old gods, still keeping their old books, held an auto de fe, an act of faith, a great public ceremony of purification and punishment. He gathered the Maya religious objects he could find, the idols, the ritual vessels, and he gathered the books, the codices, the painted screenfold manuscripts in which the Maya had recorded their astronomy and their calendars and their history and their religion, the accumulated written knowledge of their civilization, the libraries of the scribe priests, and he burned them. He burned them all, or all he could find. A great fire of the painted books of the Maya, the codices going up in flame and smoke, centuries of accumulated knowledge, the written memory of a civilization, consumed in an afternoon. We found a large number of books, Landa himself wrote, in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which there was not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burnt them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. That sentence, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction, is one of the most heartbreaking in all the records of the conquest. The Maya watching their books burn, their literature, their history, their sacred knowledge, consumed before their eyes, and grieving it to an amazing degree, and the friar noting their grief, and burning the books anyway, certain he was doing the work of God by destroying the work of the devil. How many books were burned, we will never know. Dozens, certainly, perhaps far more. And Landa's burning was only the most famous of many such destructions across the Maya world as the missionaries did their work. What we do know is the scale of the loss, that of the entire written literature of the ancient Maya, the thousands of books that must once have existed, the libraries of the great cities, the accumulated knowledge of a literate civilization across 1,000 years. There survive today, in all the world, exactly four Maya books, escaped somehow from the fires, carried to Europe in the early years of the conquest, and forgotten in libraries and rediscovered centuries later, named now for the cities where they came to rest. The Dresden Codex, the most beautiful and complete, with its astronomical tables, its Venus tables, its eclipse tables, the masterpiece of surviving Maya astronomy, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, fragmentary and worn, and a fourth, the Maya Codex of Mexico, once called the Grolier Codex, whose authenticity was long debated, but is now generally accepted, the oldest of the four. 4 books, that is what remains of the written literature of the Maya. 4 books, against the thousands that were burned. 4 pages, as it were, torn from a library that was set on fire. Everything else we can read. We read from the stone monuments and the painted pottery, the inscriptions that were too heavy, or too scattered, or too hidden in the forest to burn. But the books, the real literature, the accumulated written knowledge, the libraries of the scribe priests, are gone. 4 lonely survivors excepted, and the loss is permanent and total and incalculable. One of the great deletions in the memory of the human species, accomplished in an afternoon by a man who was certain he was doing good, and yet, here is the strange twist, the irony that runs through the whole story of Diego de Landa. The man who burned the books also, with his own hand, preserved the single most important key to reading them. For Landa, after his return to Spain, where he was called to account for the harshness of his methods, including torture, against the Maya, wrote an account of the Maya, their history, their customs, their religion, their calendar, and their writing. A book called the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, the account of the things of Yucatan, in an effort to describe and explain the people he had worked among and, in his way, tried to destroy. And in that account, trying to understand and record the Maya writing he had burned, Landa did something that would prove, centuries later, to be of incalculable value. He asked his Maya informants to show him their alphabet, and he wrote down what they gave him, a list of Maya glyphs that he believed corresponded to the letters of the Spanish alphabet. When Landa asked his informant to write the letter B, the informant, naturally enough, gave him the Maya syllable that sounded like the Spanish name of the letter, Bay, and so on through the alphabet, producing not an alphabet at all, but a garbled list of Maya syllabic signs, filtered through a fundamental misunderstanding of how the script worked. For centuries, Landa's alphabet was regarded as worthless, a confused and useless artifact of the friar's incomprehension, a key that fit no lock. But it was not worthless. It was, in fact, the Rosetta Stone of the Maya, a list of Maya syllabic signs with their phonetic values, recorded from native informants who could still read and write the script, the only such record to survive the burning. And when, in the middle of the 20th century, scholars finally began to understand that the Maya script was syllabic, that it recorded sounds and not just ideas, it was Landa's despised alphabet, recognized at last for what it really was, a list of syllable signs that provided the crucial key, the bridge between the sounds of the Maya language and the signs on the monuments, the thing that finally cracked the script and let the silent stones speak. The man who burned the library preserved the key to reading what little of it survived. The destroyer was also, against all his intentions, the preserver. History is rarely so cruelly, so perfectly ironic. The decipherment of Maya writing is one of the great intellectual adventures of the 20th century, a detective story spread across decades and continents, and it deserves to be told because it is the reason we can speak tonight of named kings and dated wars and the recovered history of the classic Maya world, rather than merely of silent stones and faceless mystery. For most of the time the modern world had known the Maya. The glyphs were unread, and the prevailing view, dominated by powerful scholars in the early 20th century, held that they could not be fully read at all, that Maya writing was not true writing, not a record of spoken language, but a system of mystical and calendrical symbols, recording dates and astronomy and religious abstractions, but not history, not names, not the actual words of an actual language. The great authority of the mid-20th century, the British scholar Eric Thompson, held this view with such force and prestige that it dominated the field for decades and actively impeded the recognition that the script was, in fact, a fully phonetic writing system capable of recording anything the Maya could say. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, from a young Soviet scholar named Yuri Knorozov, working in Moscow in the early 1950s, far from the centers of Maya studies, with limited access to materials, in the depths of the Cold War. Knorozov, studying Landa's account and the surviving codices, recognized what the Western establishment had missed, that the Maya script was phonetic, syllabic, that Landa's alphabet was really a list of syllable signs, and that the glyphs could be read as sounds, spelling out words in the Maya language. He published his findings in the 1950s, and was, for years, dismissed and attacked by the Western establishment, partly on the merits and partly through the poisonous politics of the Cold War. His work tainted in Western eyes by its Soviet origin, championed by his own government as a triumph of Marxist scholarship, and therefore suspect in the West. But Morozov was right. Slowly, through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, as a new generation of scholars took up his insight and combined it with other breakthroughs, the recognition by the scholar Tatiana Proskuryakov that the patterns of dates on the monuments recorded the life events of historical individuals, real kings with real reigns, births and accessions and deaths, history and not just astronomy. The decipherment gathered pace and then accelerated into a flood. The phonetic approach unlocked the script. The recognition of history unlocked the content. And across a few transformative decades, the silent monuments of the Maya began, at last, to speak. The names of the kings emerging one by one, the dynasties reconstructed, the wars and alliances and rituals read off the stones, a whole lost political history rising up out of the carved glyphs after 12 centuries of silence. Today, the great majority of Maya inscriptions can be read, and the Maya have been transformed, in the space of a few generations, from a faceless mystery into one of the best documented civilizations of the ancient world. Their kings named, their history recovered, their own words audible again across the centuries. A triumph of human ingenuity and patience and international scholarship, built on the despised key that a book-burning friar had preserved, cracked by a Soviet scholar the Western establishment refused to believe, completed by generations of patient minds learning, at last, to hear the voices in the stone. And now we arrive at the truth that this whole night has been circling, the truth that corrects the deepest misunderstanding about the Maya, the thing that must be said clearly and held firmly against the whole romantic mythology of the lost civilization. The Maya are not lost. The Maya are not gone. The Maya did not vanish into the jungle or disappear from the earth or dwindle into a mysterious extinction. The Maya are here, now, today, alive, millions of them, in the same lands their ancestors lived in, speaking the languages their ancestors spoke, growing the maize their ancestors grew, telling some of the stories their ancestors told. There are around 6 million Maya alive today. Some estimates put it higher, across Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, speaking some 30 distinct but related Mayan languages, the living descendants and inheritors of the civilization we have spent the night exploring. They are not a vanished people. They are our contemporaries. This matters enormously, and not only as a correction of fact. It matters because the myth of the lost or vanished Maya, the romantic image of the mysterious dead civilization, swallowed by the jungle, its people gone, has done real harm. It has erased the living Maya from view, written them out of their own story, treated their magnificent heritage as the property of a dead past, rather than the living inheritance of a present people. It has allowed the ruins to be seen as belonging to no one, as mysteries for outsiders to solve, treasures for outsiders to claim, rather than as the ancestral monuments of communities who still live in their shadow. The Maya did not abandon the Yucatan. Their descendants farm it still. They did not forget their calendar. In some highland communities, the ancient 260-day sacred count has been kept, unbroken, by traditional daykeepers, from the time of the classic cities down to the present, never lost, never interrupted, the sacred days named and counted across more than 1,000 years and through the whole catastrophe of the Conquest. One of the longest continuous cultural traditions on Earth, alive in Guatemalan towns today. They did not lose their stories. The Popol Vuh was written down by a Maya hand, in the Maya language, to preserve the old knowledge through the Conquest, and the Quiché who preserved it have descendants who tell its stories still. The weaving, the milpa, the languages, the foods, the prayers, the deep relationship with maize and the forest and the cycles of time, these live, transformed by 5 centuries of conquest and colonization and modern pressures, but alive, carried forward by a people who endured the collapse of the classic cities, the catastrophe of the Conquest, the plagues and the colonization and the long centuries of oppression, and who are still here, still Maya, still keeping what they have kept. The 20th century was hard on them, particularly in Guatemala, where the Maya suffered terribly during the long civil war of the late 20th century, a conflict in which the indigenous Maya population bore the overwhelming brunt of the violence, with tens of thousands killed in campaigns that international bodies have recognized as genocide. Whole villages destroyed, a people targeted for being who they were. The survival of the Maya has not been a gentle thing. It has been wrested, again and again, from the jaws of catastrophe, held onto through suffering that did not end with the ancient conquest, but has continued, in new forms, into living memory. And yet they have survived, and more than survived. There is today a vibrant movement of Maya cultural revitalization, of pride in the ancient heritage now that it can be read and understood, of Maya scholars and activists and artists reclaiming their own history, learning to read the glyphs of their ancestors, asserting their place as the living heirs of one of the world's great civilizations. The story of the Maya does not end in the 9th century with the collapse, or in the 16th with the conquest, or in any past moment at all. It continues. It is being written now by the living Maya, the people of Maize, who were never lost, who are still here, who are still keeping the days. How did the modern world come to know the ancient Maya at all? The cities had been swallowed by the forest, the southern heartland abandoned for 1,000 years, the great pyramids drowned in jungle, known only to the local Maya who lived among them, and to a few scattered colonial accounts that the wider world had largely ignored or disbelieved. The story of how the ruins were brought to the world's attention is, like so much in the study of the Maya, a tale of two travelers, an American writer and an English artist, whose journey through the forests of Central America in the late 1830s and early 40s produced the books that, more than anything else, revealed the Maya to the modern world and launched the whole long adventure of their rediscovery. The writer was John Lloyd Stevens, an American lawyer and traveler with a gift for vivid prose and a restless curiosity. The artist was Frederick Catherwood, an Englishman of extraordinary skill and patience, whose drawings of the ruins remain, in their accuracy and beauty, among the finest ever made. Together, in 1839 and again in 1841, they journeyed through the forests of Honduras, Guatemala, Chiapas, and the Yucatan, hacking their way through the jungle, suffering through fever and rain and hardship, to reach and document the ruined cities that rumor and scattered report had placed in the wilderness. They reached Copan first, Stevens famously buying the entire ruined city for $50 from a bewildered local landowner who could not imagine what the strange foreigner wanted with a jungle full of old stones. And there, hacking away the vegetation, they found the carved stelae and the temples and the hieroglyphic stairway, and Catherwood, working in the gloom of the forest, plagued by mosquitoes, struggling to render the alien intricacy of carvings unlike anything in the European tradition, made his astonishing drawings, and Stevens wrote his vivid, wondering prose. They went on to Palenque, to Uxmal, to Chichen Itza, to dozens of sites, documenting as they went, and then Stevens published their findings in 2 books, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, and its sequel on the Yucatan, illustrated with Catherwood's engravings that became immediate sensations, read across America and Europe, bringing the lost cities of the Maya into the imagination of the modern world for the first time. And Stevens, to his enormous credit, got the most important thing right against the prejudices of his age, which were strong and ugly and persistent. For the great question that the ruins provoked in the 19th century mind was, who built them? And the answer that many Europeans and Americans wanted to give, driven by the racist assumption that the primitive native peoples they saw around them could not possibly have built such magnificent cities, was that the ruins must have been built by someone else, by wandering Egyptians, or Phoenicians, or the lost tribes of Israel, or refugees from Atlantis, or any imaginable people other than the ancestors of the living Maya. This poisonous idea that the great works of the Americas must have been built by outsiders because the native peoples were incapable of them, has proven astonishingly durable, and it persists today in the ancient aliens fantasies and the lost civilization mythologies that still cling to the Maya and to every other great achievement of peoples that Western prejudice preferred to underestimate. But Stevens, looking at the ruins and looking at the living Maya around him, rejected it. The cities, he concluded, were built by the ancestors of the people who still lived among them. The Maya themselves, no one else, no wanderers from the old world, no lost race, but the forebears of the very people guiding him through the forest. He was right, completely right, and admirably so for his time, and the whole subsequent science of Maya archaeology has confirmed him 1,000 times over. The Maya built the Maya cities. It should never have needed saying, that it did need saying, that it still needs saying, against the persistent fantasies, is a measure of how hard the world has found it to grant the peoples of the Americas the simple dignity of their own achievements. For a century and a half after Stevens and Catherwood, the study of the Maya advanced through the patient labor of archaeologists hacking through the jungle, mapping the ruins by hand, excavating the temples and tombs, slowly reconstructing the civilization site by site, season by season, in the heat and the rain and the difficulty of the tropical forest. And then, in the last decade or so, a new technology transformed the field overnight, more profoundly perhaps than anything since the decipherment of the glyphs. And it did so by solving the oldest problem in Maya archaeology, the forest itself, the dense canopy that hid everything, that had to be cleared by hand to see what lay beneath, that concealed the true extent of the Maya world under its impenetrable green roof. The technology is called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and what it has revealed has rewritten our understanding of the scale of Maya civilization. LiDAR works by mounting a laser scanner on an aircraft and flying it over the forest, firing millions of pulses of laser light down at the ground every second. Most of the pulses hit the leaves and branches of the canopy and bounce back, but a few, through the gaps in the foliage, reach all the way to the forest floor and bounce back from there. By measuring the time each pulse takes to return, and by gathering billions of them, and by computationally stripping away all the returns from the vegetation and keeping only those that reached the ground, the LiDAR system can construct a precise three-dimensional map of the actual surface of the earth beneath the forest. The bare ground, with all the trees digitally removed, revealed as if the jungle had been lifted away. And when archaeologists first turned LiDAR on the Maya lowlands, on a large scale, in the late 2010s, what they saw astonished even the specialists who had spent their lives studying the Maya. Beneath the forest, invisible from the ground, hidden under the canopy that the human eye could never penetrate, lay the Maya world entire, not just the great temple centers that had been known and mapped, but everything around and between them, tens of thousands of structures, houses and platforms and temples, vast networks of agricultural terraces and irrigation canals and drained fields covering the landscape, defensive walls and fortifications, great raised causeways running for miles through the forest connecting the cities, reservoirs and quarries, and the whole infrastructure of a densely settled, intensively engineered, thoroughly humanized landscape, all of it hidden under the trees, all of it revealed in an instant by the laser. The true scale of the Maya world made suddenly visible after centuries of being hidden in plain sight beneath the green. The implications were staggering, and they overturned long-held assumptions. The Maya lowlands, it turned out, had been far more densely populated than most scholars had dared to believe. Not scattered ceremonial centers in a thinly settled forest, but a continuous, intensively developed landscape, supporting a population in the millions, perhaps far higher than previous estimates, a civilization of a scale and density comparable to the great urbanized regions of the ancient Old World. The forest that we see today, the seemingly pristine wilderness, is not pristine at all. It is a forest that has grown up over a vast abandoned cultural landscape, a green blanket thrown over the works of millions of people, a wilderness that is really the overgrowth of a civilization. The LiDAR revealed that the Maya had not lived lightly in a wild jungle. They had transformed their whole world, engineered it on an enormous scale, filled it with people and fields and roads and cities, to a degree that the surface survey could never have shown. And it deepened, at the same time, the mystery and the tragedy of the collapse. For the larger and denser we now understand the classic Maya population to have been, the more total and more catastrophic the collapse that emptied that landscape, the more people must have died or fled or dispersed, the more complete the abandonment of a world that had been, we now know, one of the great densely settled regions of the ancient earth. We have spoken of the great gods and the cosmic myths, of Kukulkan the feathered serpent and the maize god, and the lords of Xibalba and the hero twins. But the religion of the ordinary Maya, then and now, was lived not only in the great public ceremonies of the kings, but in the small daily devotions of the household and the field, in a dense and intimate relationship with a world full of sacred powers and presences. And it is worth spending an hour, in the deep of the night, with the everyday holiness of the Maya world, because it survives, much of it, transformed but recognizable, among the living Maya today, one of the most resilient threads connecting the ancient civilization to the present. The Maya world was, and is, full of gods and spirits and sacred forces, not the remote deities of the great temples only, but the powers of the immediate world, the spirits of the rain and the wind and the mountains and the caves, the lords of the forest and the animals, the spirits of the maize and the milpa, the ancestors beneath the floor, the powerful and dangerous beings of the wild places, the rain gods, the charks, the bringers of the precious water in a land that lived and died by the rains, were perhaps the most important deities of daily devotion. propitiated with offerings and prayers and, in extremity, with sacrifice, for nothing mattered more than the coming of the rain in its season. The caves and cenotes were sacred, doorways to the underworld and the realm of the rain and the dead, places of offering and pilgrimage and fear. The mountains were sacred, the homes of powerful spirits and the ancestors, and the forest itself was a living sacred presence, full of guardians and spirits, its animals charged with meaning, the jaguar, the lord of the night and the underworld, the companion spirit of kings and shamans, the serpent, the vision bringer, the celestial and the earthly power, the quetzal, the bird of the sacred feathers, the bat, the death creature of the bat house, where Hunahpu lost his head, the monkey, the failed first people, the patron of the arts and the scribes. And every person, in Maya understanding, was bound to the sacred world in an intimate way. Through the day of their birth in the sacred calendar, which shaped their character and fate, through their companion spirit or coessence, the way, an animal or natural force with which a person was spiritually linked, sharing its nature and its destiny, so that what happened to your way happened, in some sense, to you, through the constant small observances and offerings that wove daily life into the sacred order. The shaman, the daykeeper, the ritual specialist who could read the calendar and divine the will of the gods and intercede with the powers of the other world, was, and in traditional Maya communities still is, a central figure, the keeper of the sacred count, the diviner who casts the sacred seeds and crystals to read the days and answer the questions the people bring, the healer who treats the illnesses that are understood to have spiritual as well as physical causes, the intermediary between the human community and the dense sacred world that surrounds it. Much of this survives. In the highland Maya towns today, the daykeepers still keep the 260-day sacred calendar, still divine with the sacred seeds, still maintain the relationship with the ancestors and the spirits of the mountains and the caves, often woven together now with the Catholicism that the Conquest brought, in a rich syncretic blend in which the old gods wear the names of saints and the ancient rhythms continue beneath the Christian calendar. The everyday holiness of the Maya world, the sense of a cosmos dense with sacred presence, the intimate binding of each person to the sacred through the day of their birth and their companion spirit, the daily small devotions, the keeping of the sacred days, is one of the most durable things the Maya have carried through the centuries, a living thread reaching from the household shrines of the classic period, from the ancestors beneath the floor, down to the daykeepers casting their seeds in the highland towns tonight. Let us pause, before the night closes, to gather and consider the full scope of what the Maya achieved in the realms we would call science and mathematics. Because it is easy, amid the temples and the kings and the sacrifice, to lose sight of just how remarkable their intellectual accomplishments were, and just how strange and impressive it is that they achieved them in the circumstances they did, in a tropical forest, without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, without contact with the intellectual traditions of the old world, building from nothing, in isolation, a science of time and number, and the heavens that stands comparison with anything the ancient world produced. Consider that they invented, independently and from nothing, the concept of zero and a true place value number system, an achievement that the great civilizations of the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome, never managed, and that reached Europe only late and from outside. Consider that they calculated the length of the solar year more accurately than the Julian calendar that Europe used until the 16th century, that their estimate of the year, embedded in their calendrical calculations, was closer to the true value than the calendar Columbus sailed under. Consider that they tracked the cycle of Venus to within a couple of hours over the course of its 584-day average, that they predicted eclipses, that they tracked the moon and the planets and built their cities in precise alignment with the movements of the sun, capturing the equinox in the shadow serpent of Chichen Itza through an architecture calculated across decades of patient observation. Consider that they did all of this, the mathematics, the astronomy, the calendar of breathtaking precision and reach, without telescopes, without metal instruments, without written numbers easier to manipulate than their own elegant dots and bars, by the patient accumulation of naked-eye observation across generations, recorded in books that were almost all later burned, sustained by a civilization that had every material disadvantage, and overcame them through sheer intellectual persistence and the deep cultural commitment to the tracking of sacred time. And consider what it means, the deepest lesson of Maya science, perhaps. The Maya pursued their astronomy and their mathematics not as we pursue science, in a spirit of disinterested inquiry into the nature of things, but as a sacred enterprise, a religious obligation, a means of tracking the divine order of time and reading the will of the gods, and knowing the proper sacred rhythms of the cosmos. They calculated the Venus cycle, because Venus was a dangerous god whose movements had to be known and guarded against. They tracked the eclipses, because the eclipse was the devouring of the sun or moon by cosmic forces, to be predicted and prepared for. They built the great calendar, because time itself was sacred, a divine burden carried by the gods, an order that had to be known and honored. Their science was their religion, and their religion was their science. The two were one, a single great enterprise of tracking and honoring the sacred order of the cosmos. And in pursuing that sacred enterprise, with the patience and devotion that only religion can sustain across the centuries, they discovered, as the Babylonian astronomer priests discovered, watching their own sky for their own gods, the actual mathematical order of the heavens, the real cycles of the real planets, the genuine structure of time and number that underlies the cosmos, whether or not the gods are watching. They were looking for the sacred. They found the science. And the two, in the end, were not so different as we like to imagine. Both of them the disciplined attention of the human mind to the order of the world, the patient watching, the careful recording, the deep faith that the cosmos has a pattern, and that the pattern can be known. The Maya had that faith, and that patience, and that attention, in full measure, and with them, in their forest cities, under their swarming stars, they built a science of time and the heavens that the world is still, even now, learning to fully appreciate. We have spoken of the burning of the books, and of the 4 codices that survived, but those 4 lonely survivors deserve an hour of their own, in the deep of the night, because they are the only books of the ancient Maya that remain in all the world, the sole survivors of a vast burned literature, and each one is a treasure beyond price, a window into the Maya mind that nothing else can quite provide. To turn the painted pages of a Maya codex, even in reproduction, even across the glass of a museum case, is to hold in your eyes the actual work of the scribe priests, the accumulated knowledge of the civilization, the books the kings consulted, and the astronomers calculated from, and the diviners read, the things that Diego de Landa thought were the lies of the devil, and burned by the hundreds, of which these 4 alone escaped the fire. The greatest is the Dresden Codex, named for the German city where it has resided for centuries, having been acquired by the Royal Library there in the early 18th century. Its origins before that a mystery. How it travelled from the Maya world to a European library, who carried it and when, we do not know. But somehow this one book escaped the burning and crossed the ocean and survived. It is the most beautiful and the most complete of the 78 pages painted on both sides of a long strip of bark paper folded into a screen fold. And it is, above all, an astronomical and divinatory masterpiece. It contains the great Venus tables, tracking the cycle of the war star across centuries with the precision we have marveled at. It contains eclipse tables, predicting the dangerous devourings of the sun and moon. It contains ritual and divinatory almanacs, tying the sacred calendar to the gods and the proper observances. It contains, on one famous and haunting final page, an image of cosmic destruction, a great serpent pouring water from the sky, the world flood, the end of an age, painted in the deep blue of the rain and the destruction. The Dresden Codex survived the firebombing of Dresden in the Second World War, water-damaged, but intact. The ancient Maya book enduring the fire of the 20th century, as it had escaped the fire of the 16th, a survivor twice over, carrying its Venus tables and its eclipse predictions and its image of the world's end, down through every catastrophe of the centuries to reach us, the single most important surviving document of Maya astronomy, the masterpiece of the 4. The Madrid Codex, the longest of the 4, is more concerned with divination and ritual and the daily concerns of life. Almanacs for the diviners, for agriculture, for hunting and beekeeping and weaving and the rituals of the year. A more practical and workaday book than the astronomical Dresden, a window into the religion of everyday life. The Paris Codex, fragmentary and worn, its surface badly damaged, contains material on the cycles of the Catuns, the 20-year periods of the long count, and on what appears to be a Maya zodiac, the constellations of the Maya sky. And the 4th, the Maya Codex of Mexico, long known as the Graulier Codex, after the New York club where it was first exhibited after its murky appearance on the antiquities market in the 1960s, was for decades suspected of being a forgery, so strange were the circumstances of its appearance. But careful study has now established it as genuine, and indeed as the oldest of the 4 surviving Maya books, a fragment of a Venus almanac, simpler than the Dresden's but older, the most ancient Maya book in existence. 4 books, the Dresden, the Madrid, the Paris, the Mexico. That is the surviving library of one of the world's great literate civilizations, 4 books, against the thousands that burned, and we are fortunate beyond measure to have even these 4 pages torn from the fire, these 4 voices surviving from the silenced chorus of a whole lost literature. Let us return, before the end, to the living world of the Maya, to the food and the feast and the forest that fed them, because we have spoken much of gods and kings and the cosmic order, and a civilization is also, always, a way of eating, a relationship with the living world that sustains it, and the Maya relationship with their forest and their food was one of remarkable sophistication and richness. We have spoken of maize, the foundation of everything, the substance of the gods and the people, and of the milpa, the maize field with its 3 sisters of corn and beans and squash, and of cacao, the sacred drink of the elite. But the Maya table was far richer than maize alone, and the Maya relationship with the forest far more intricate than simple farming. The Maya did not merely clear the forest to plant their fields. They cultivated the forest itself, in a practice that some scholars now call the forest garden, managing and shaping the wild forest over generations to favor useful trees and plants, until what looks to the untrained eye like wild jungle is, in significant part, a humanized landscape, a vast orchard and garden tended across centuries, full of fruit trees and useful palms and medicinal plants, and the cacao and the trees that fed the people and the animals they hunted. The ramon, or breadnut tree, which produces an abundant and storable nutritious seed, grows in dense stands around many Maya ruins, so dense that some scholars believe it was deliberately cultivated as a staple supplement to maize, a forest crop tended around the cities. The Maya kept gardens around their houses, dense intimate plots of fruit trees and vegetables and herbs and medicinal plants. The household garden, a Maya institution that survives today. They harvested the abundance of the forest, the fruits, the honey of the stingless bees they kept in hollow logs. Beekeeping was an important Maya practice, the honey both food and offering and trade good. The game they hunted with bow and blowgun and trap. Deer, peccary, tapir, the great birds, the iguana, the fish of the rivers and the coast. They grew chili peppers, the essential flavoring, in dozens of varieties. They grew squash and beans in great diversity. They grew tomatoes and avocados and sweet potatoes and manioc, and the dozens of other crops that the agriculture of the Americas had developed. They harvested the vanilla orchid, another Mesoamerican gift to the world's table, and flavored their cacao with it. The Maya feast, the great ceremonial meals of the elite, the feasts that bound the social order together, where the lords displayed their wealth and generosity, and the painted cacao vessels were brought out, and the obligations of rank and reciprocity were enacted through the giving and consuming of food, was a central institution of the society, as the feast is in so many cultures, the sharing of food the deepest bond of the human community. The tamale, maize dough wrapped around fillings and steamed in leaves, was the festival food, the elaborated form of the daily maize, prepared in countless varieties for the great occasions. The cacao was poured and frothed and drunk from the precious vessels. The game and the fish and the fruits of the forest and the products of the milpa were brought together in the abundance of the feast, the display of plenty that was the proof of a great lord's worthiness and the binding of the community in shared consumption. And beneath the feast, always, the daily reality. The maize ground on the metate in the dawn, the tortillas cooked on the griddle, the beans and the chili, the household garden, the managed forest, the deep, intricate, sustainable relationship with the living world of the tropical forest that the Maya had worked out across thousands of years and that fed their civilization, and that their descendants, in the milpas and forest gardens of the Maya world today, still in significant part maintain the oldest agricultural tradition of the Americas, the way of the people of maize, alive in the forest still. Before we let the forest take the cities one last time and settle into the close of the night, let us consider the building itself, the sheer physical achievement of the Maya architecture, the raising of the temple mountains and the palaces and the causeways and the reservoirs, accomplished, like everything in the Maya world, without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, by human muscle and ingenuity and the patient accumulated labor of generations, in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Think of what it meant to build a pyramid like Temple 4 at Tikal, 70 meters, 230 feet, of cut and fitted limestone and rubble fill, raised above the forest floor, with no metal tools to cut the stone, no wheels to move it, no animals to haul it, no pulleys or cranes as we would understand them. The limestone was quarried with stone tools and wooden wedges, the workers cutting the soft local stone from quarries near the cities, often the very depressions left by the quarrying, becoming the reservoirs that held the city's water. The Maya quarrying their building stone and creating their water storage in a single integrated act of landscape engineering. The stone was moved by human porters and by levering and rolling, dragged on sledges, carried on backs, raised up the rising structure on ramps of earth and rubble that were built up alongside the growing pyramid and removed when it was done. The Maya made lime plaster, burning limestone in great kilns, which consumed enormous quantities of wood and contributed, some scholars think, to the deforestation that helped bring the collapse. And with the plaster they coated the buildings, sculpted the elaborate stucco facades, paved the plazas and the causeways, surfaced the reservoirs, the brilliant white lime plaster the skin of the Maya city, painted then in the sacred reds and blues. They developed the corbelled vault, the characteristic Maya arch, built by stepping successive courses of stone inward until they met at the top, capped with a single stone, a method that could not span wide spaces, and so gave Maya interior rooms their characteristic narrow, high, dim quality, the thick walls and small dark chambers beneath the great mass of the roofs and the towering roof combs above. It was not the true arch of the Romans, which the Maya never developed, but it was an elegant solution within its limits, and it roofed the palaces and temples of the whole civilization, and they built not only upward, but outward and downward. The great causeways, the sakbiob, the white roads, raised and plastered roads running dead straight through the forest and swamp, connecting the parts of a city and sometimes connecting cities to each other across miles of forest, the white plaster gleaming, the roads both practical arteries and sacred ways, processional routes charged with meaning. They built the vast reservoir systems, the engineered water management that made the lowland cities possible, the catchment surfaces and canals and tanks and the filtration systems that recent research has found at Tikal, beds of sand and quartz crystal that filtered the city's drinking water, one of the oldest water filtration systems known anywhere in the world. They terraced the hillsides for farming, drained the swamps into raised fields, reshaped the very surface of their world on the enormous scale that the LiDAR has now revealed, all of it by hand, by human labor, by the patient organized effort of a civilization that had no metal and no wheel and no beasts of burden, that built its mountains and its roads and its water systems and its whole engineered landscape out of stone and plaster and earth and the muscle and ingenuity of its people. One of the great achievements of human engineering, accomplished in the most difficult of circumstances, standing still, in part, after 1,000 years of abandonment, the Temple Mountains rising above the forest, the white roads buried beneath it, the works of the people of Maize enduring in the green dark long after the hands that raised them returned to the earth they were made from. As the night draws toward its close, let us gather what the Maya have given, not only to their own descendants, the living Maya who carry their heritage forward, but to all of us, to the whole human world, the gifts and the lessons that this remarkable civilization offers across the centuries to anyone willing to receive them. For the Maya are not only a wonder to contemplate, they are a teacher, if we will listen, and what they have to teach is among the most valuable knowledge any civilization has left behind. They give us, first, the simple and astonishing fact of themselves, the proof that human genius is universal, that the capacity for great civilization, for mathematics and astronomy and writing and art, and the deep contemplation of time and the cosmos, belongs to no single people or place or tradition, but to humanity as a whole, arising independently wherever human beings gather and settle and turn their minds to the order of the world. The Maya invented writing and zero and a calendar of breathtaking precision in total isolation from the civilizations of the Old World. With no contact, no influence, no borrowing, they built it all themselves, from nothing, in a tropical forest, and in doing so they prove, as nothing else quite can, that the achievements of civilization are the common inheritance and the common capacity of the whole human species, against every racist fantasy that the great works of the Americas must have been built by outsiders. The Maya stand as the definitive refutation. They built it themselves, the people of Maize, in their forest, with their own hands and their own minds, and the magnificence of what they built is the magnificence of human possibility itself. They give us, too, a warning, the hard lesson of the collapse, which speaks across the centuries to our own world with uncomfortable directness. For the classic Maya were not destroyed by a stronger enemy or a sudden catastrophe from outside. They were undone, in large part, by their own success, by a population that grew beyond what their environment could sustain, by the degradation of the forest and the soil and the water on which they depended, by the pushing of a fragile natural system past its limits, and by the failure, when the drought came, of a social and religious order that had grown too rigid and too dependent on a single fragile balance to adapt. It is a story of a civilization that transformed its environment on an enormous scale, that grew and grew on the strength of its own ingenuity, and that found, when the climate turned against it, that it had used up the margin of safety, stripped away the resilience, built a magnificent and brittle structure that could not bend when the pressure came, and so broke. We do not need to draw the parallel too crudely. The Maya were not us, and their world was not ours, but the shape of the lesson is hard to miss, and it grows harder to miss with every passing year. That a civilization can be brought down, not by its weakness, but by its strength, not by its enemies, but by its own success, by the slow degradation of the natural foundation on which all its magnificence rests, until the moment when the climate shifts and the margin is gone and the brittle structure breaks. The Maya built a wonder in an impossible place and sustained it for 600 years, and then the impossible place, pushed too far, took it back. There is a warning in that, for any civilization that believes its ingenuity has freed it from the limits of the living world that sustains it, and they give us, finally, the example of endurance. For the deepest truth of the Maya, the truth this whole night has circled and returned to, is that they survived. The cities fell, the books burned, the conquest came with its sword and its plagues and its centuries of oppression. The 20th century brought genocide to the highland Maya in living memory, and through all of it, against all of it, the Maya endured. They are here, 6 million of them and more, speaking their languages, growing their maize, keeping their days, telling their stories, carrying forward across every catastrophe the heritage of one of the world's great civilizations, refusing to be the vanished people that the romantic myth wanted them to be, insisting by their very existence that the story is not over, that the people of Maize are still here, still keeping the sacred count, still tending the forest garden, still alive in the lands their ancestors made magnificent. That endurance, that refusal to vanish, that survival through 5 centuries of catastrophe, is perhaps the greatest Maya achievement of all, greater than the pyramids or the calendar or the zero, and it is the note on which their story should end, not with the fall of the cities or the burning of the books, but with the living Maya, here, now, our contemporaries, the inheritors of the forest and the stars. We have walked through the Maya world in silence, through the carved stone and the painted walls and the silent ruins, but the living Maya world was never silent, and no picture of it is complete without the sound that filled its plazas and temples and feasts. Music, which the Maya loved, and which accompanied every great occasion of their lives, the ceremonies and the dances and the processions and the rituals, a rich and various music of drums and flutes and rattles and the strange haunting voices of instruments we can only partly reconstruct. For the music itself is gone, vanished into the air 1,000 years ago, leaving only the instruments in the tombs and the images on the painted walls to tell us that it was there. The Bonampak murals, which show us so much, show us the music too. A procession of musicians in one of the great painted scenes, playing their instruments in the ceremony, and from them, and from the surviving instruments and the images on the painted pottery we can reconstruct, at least in part, the Maya orchestra. There were drums of many kinds. Great upright wooden drums with skin heads, beaten with the hands. The slit drum, the tungkul, a hollow log with tongues cut into it that gave different tones when struck, an instrument of deep resonant power that could carry across the forest. Small clay hand drums. There were rattles, the gourd rattles filled with seeds that shake through the rituals of the Americas to this day, shaken by the dancers and the priests. There were flutes and whistles of clay and bone, some of them shaped as gods or animals or human figures, capable of haunting and complex melodies, found in great numbers in the tombs and offerings. The Maya were makers of fine ceramic flutes and ocarinas, and some of the surviving instruments can still be played, their voices reaching us across the centuries. The actual sound of the Maya world, breathy and strange and beautiful. There were trumpets of wood and of conch shell, the great seashell trumpets that boomed through the ceremonies, the conch itself a sacred object, a voice of the sea and the wind. There were rasps, notched bones scraped to make a rhythmic grinding sound, some of them made from human bone, the bones of ancestors or captives, the dead participating in the music of the living. And there was the dance, for the music was made for dancing, and dance was central to Maya ceremony, the kings themselves dancing in the regalia of the gods, becoming the gods through the dance, the great public performances in which the Holy Lord, costumed and masked and crowned, danced before his people, as the maize god, or the rain god, or the celestial powers. The dance the very means by which the human and the divine were joined. The king's body the vessel through which the god moved and appeared. The painted pottery shows these dances, the lords in their towering feathered headdresses and their jade and their god costumes, frozen in the steps of the sacred dance, the music we cannot hear playing around them. To imagine the Maya world fully is to fill it with this lost music and this lost dance. The boom of the conch and the slit drum carrying across the plaza, the rattles shaking, the clay flutes piping their strange melodies, the great drums pounding, and the king dancing as the god before tens of thousands of his people, in the blazing red and white city, under the tropical sun, or the swarming stars, the whole civilization gathered in the sound, and the movement, and the sacred performance. All of it vanished now, silent. The instruments in the museum cases, the dancers 1,000 years in their graves, the music gone into the air, but real once, filling this forest that is silent now except for the insects and the monkeys, alive once with the sound of the people of Maize, in a civilization without the germ theory of disease, without modern medicine, living in a tropical environment rich in both healing plants and deadly diseases. The work of healing was among the most important and most respected in Maya society, and the Maya healer, the curer, the keeper of the knowledge of plants and the rituals of cure, was a central figure, drawing on a vast traditional pharmacopoeia and a deep understanding of the medicinal properties of the forest that the modern world is, even now, still working to recover and appreciate. Maya medicine was not separate from Maya religion. Illness was understood to have spiritual as well as physical causes. The anger of a god, the malice of a sorcerer, the loss or damage of the soul, the imbalance of the forces that governed health. And so the healer was both a physician and a priest, treating the body with herbs and the spirit with ritual, the two inseparable, the cure addressing the whole person and the whole web of sacred relationships in which the person was embedded. But within and alongside the spiritual framework was real empirical knowledge, a vast, accumulated, tested understanding of the medicinal plants of the forest, built up across generations of observation and use, much of which has proven, under modern investigation, to be genuinely effective. The Maya knew plants to reduce fever, to treat wounds and infections, to ease pain, to treat the diseases of the digestive system and the skin and the lungs, to aid in childbirth, to calm and to stimulate. They knew the use of tobacco, sacred and medicinal, used in healing and ritual. They knew plants that we now know contain genuinely active compounds, analgesics, anti-inflammatories, antimicrobials, the chemical defenses that tropical plants evolve in such abundance, and that the Maya had learned, through patient empirical trial across centuries, to use for human benefit. The traditional healers of the Maya world today still carry much of this knowledge, the living inheritance of the ancient pharmacopoeia, and ethnobotanists working with them have documented hundreds of medicinal plants and their uses, a body of traditional knowledge of real scientific value, some of it pointing toward compounds and treatments that modern pharmacology is only beginning to investigate. The forest, which the Maya knew so intimately, holding still in its vast chemical diversity treatments and cures that their healers found and used, and that we are still, even now, struggling to catch up with. The midwife, the bone setter, the herbalist, the diviner healer who could read the cause of an illness in the sacred calendar or the casting of the seeds. These were the medical practitioners of the Maya world, and they treated the people through the whole long history of the civilization, and treat them still in the traditional communities today, drawing on a knowledge of the body and the plants and the spirit that is one of the great underappreciated achievements of the Maya, a science of healing developed in isolation, tested across centuries, encoded in tradition, and alive still in the hands of the healers who carry it forward, the keepers, like the day keepers and the weavers and the farmers of the milpa, of a thread of ancient knowledge that the Conquest could not burn and the collapse could not break, reaching from the healers of the classic cities down to the curers of the highland towns tonight. What did the Maya believe happened after death? It is among the deepest questions any civilization answers, and the Maya answer was complex, rich, and in keeping with everything else in their world. Woven through with the cosmos of 3 levels and the great world tree, with the underworld of Xibalba and its lords of death, with the journey of the sun and the maize and the hero twins down into darkness and up again into light. Death, for the Maya, was not an end but a passage, a journey, a road, a descent into the underworld from which, like the sun each dawn and the maize each spring, the soul might hope to rise, to be reborn, to climb back toward the light. The Maya understood the human person as more than the body, as possessed of soul forces, of spiritual essences, including the companion spirit, the way, the animal or natural coessence with which a person shared their nature and destiny. At death, the soul forces left the body and began the journey, and for most, that journey led down into Xibalba, the watery, rotting underworld, the place of fright, down through the levels of the underworld past its terrors and its lords, the same road the hero twins had travelled in the great myth, the same descent the sun made each night. It was a fearful journey, full of dangers and ordeals, the soul tested as the twins were tested in the houses of death. But the myth held the promise too, that the descent was not necessarily the end, that the twins had gone down and come back up, transformed, risen into the sky as the sun and moon, that death could be passed through and survived, and transcended, that the soul, like the maize seed buried in the dark earth, might rise again into the light. For the kings, the promise was strongest and most explicit. The dead king, like Pakal falling down the world tree on his great sarcophagus lid, descended into the underworld at death, but the same image shows the tree rising above him toward the heavens, the celestial bird in its branches, the promise of the rising held in the same picture as the fall. The kings were buried in the hearts of the pyramids, the sacred mountains, with their jade and their offerings and their wealth, equipped for the journey and the rising, often with the maize god imagery that promised rebirth. The king identified with the maize that dies and is reborn, descending to rise again, to join the ancestors in the heavens, to become a star, a god, a celestial power watching over the kingdom from the sky. The ancestors did not simply vanish. They remained present, beneath the floors of the houses where the common people buried their dead, in the tombs within the pyramids where the kings lay, accessible through ritual and bloodletting and the vision serpent, summoned back across the boundary to advise and bless the living, the dead and the living bound together in a single community across the threshold of death. The ancestors a constant presence, consulted and honored and fed, never truly gone. And so death, in the Maya world, wore the same face as everything else in their cosmos, the face of the cycle, the descent and the rising, the seed in the dark earth, the sun in the underworld, the twins in Xibalba, the maize god descending to be reborn. To die was to begin the journey down, into the place of fright, along the road the twins had travelled. But the journey down was, the myth promised, the necessary darkness before the rising, the burial of the seed before the green shoot, the descent of the sun before the dawn. The Maya built their whole understanding of death, as they built their understanding of everything, on the deep pattern they saw written everywhere in their world, in the maize, in the sun, in the stars, in the sacred days, the pattern of the cycle, the turning, the ending that is also a beginning, the descent into the dark that is also, always, the first step of the long road home toward the light. And so we come back to where we began, to the forest at night, the green dark, the warm heavy air full of the singing of insects and the distant roar of the howler monkeys, the fireflies drifting between the trunks, the stars swarming overhead through the gaps in the canopy, and the great silent pyramid rising out of the trees, swallowed by the forest, 200 feet of cut stone draped in vines and roots and the leaf fall of 1,000 years, standing in the dark where no city is, where the kings danced once in jade and quetzal feathers, before tens of thousands of their people, and where now only the monkeys sleep in the temple at the summit, and the jaguar pads across the buried plaza, and the forest keeps its long, slow, patient watch over the works of the people of Maize. Picture it whole. Now, one last time, with everything the night has given you. Picture it not as a ruin, but as it was, the red temples blazing above the green forest, the white plaza gleaming, the lords in their feathered headdresses and their jade, the smoke of copal rising from the altars, the great ball court, and the carved stelae of the kings, the scribes painting their books, the astronomers on the temple roofs tracking Venus through the dark, the women grinding the maize in the dawn light, the merchants on the white roads with their cacao and their jade and their quetzal feathers, the whole bright, vivid, painted living world of the classic Maya, here, in this place, in the depths of the forest, under these same stars, 1,000 years ago and more, and then let it fade, gently, as it faded in truth. The drought coming, the harvests failing, the people drifting away, the kings falling silent, the last monument carved, and the scribes laying down their tools, the plazas emptying, the forest creeping back season by season over the abandoned city, the vines climbing the pyramids, the trees rooting in the terraces, the green dark closing over it all, until it became what it is tonight, a silent mountain of stone in the forest, holding its memories, keeping its long sleep, waiting, but not lost, never lost. Remember that, as the forest closes around you, and the night deepens, and the long story settles into the dark. The cities sleep, but the people did not vanish. Out beyond the forest, in the highland towns and the lowland villages, in Guatemala and Mexico and Belize, the people of Maize are sleeping too tonight, under the same stars, in the lands their ancestors made magnificent, 6 million of them and more, the living Maya, who kept the days through everything, who carry the forest and the stars and the sacred count forward into the morning that is coming. The pyramid in the forest is not a tombstone. It is a seed, like the maize seed that dies in the earth and rises again as the green shoot, like the maize god descending into the underworld and rising with the year, like the hero twins going down into death and coming back to climb into the sky as the sun and the moon. The Maya knew, better than almost anyone, that things end and things begin again, that the cycle turns, that the seed buried in the dark is not dead but waiting, that the descent into the underworld is not the end of the story but the middle of it, the necessary darkness before the rising. They built their whole civilization on that knowledge. They keep it still. So let the forest hold the sleeping city. Let the stars wheel overhead in the patterns the astronomers tracked. Let the green dark be warm and close and full of the breathing of a billion living things. And let the great pyramid keep its long patient watch. And let the people of Maize sleep in their villages under the same sky, dreaming perhaps the old dreams, keeping the old days, carrying the old knowledge forward toward the dawn. You have traveled far enough tonight. You have walked through the whole world of the Maya, the forest and the Maize and the kings and the gods, the calendars and the stars and the zero, the ballgame and the bloodletting and the hero twins, the great cities and the great collapse, the burning of the books and the survival of the people. You can set it down now. The forest will keep it. The pyramid will keep it. The living Maya will keep it, as they have kept it through everything, as they keep it still tonight. Where are you listening from, tonight, traveler? Whatever forest or city or quiet room holds you, under whatever sky, know that the people of Maize are out there too, under the same stars, keeping the days, and that the great green dark of their forest is wide enough to hold us all. Close your eyes now. Let the insects sing you down. Let the fireflies drift through the warm dark behind your eyelids. Let the great pyramid rise one last time out of the trees, red against the green, blazing, alive, full of light and color, and the music of the ceremony. And then let it fade gently back into the forest and the dark, into its long sleep, into the keeping of the trees and the stars, and the patient turning of the sacred days. The maize seed sleeps in the dark earth, and is not dead, but waiting. The pyramid sleeps in the dark forest, and is not lost, but kept. And you, traveller, may sleep now too, in the green dark, under the swarming stars, in the warm breathing forest of the people of Maize, who were never lost, who are still here, who are keeping the days, and who will keep them, and keep you, until the morning comes. Sleep now. The forest is singing, the stars are turning, the days are being kept. Sleep well, travellers, and let the green dark carry you down, and under, and home.